Hello friends, settle in, get comfortable, because tonight we are stepping into England in the late 1500s, into the private world of a woman almost nobody in her lifetime was ever permitted to see after the public image of the Queen had been removed piece by piece. The most powerful woman in Europe, and yet a woman who could not close a single door behind her without several people already standing on the other side of it. Tonight, we will watch her jewels counted and locked away by candlelight, her wig lifted off to reveal a face almost nobody outside one small trusted circle ever truly saw. We will sit with the plain fact that she shared her bed with no husband at all, not once, across 45 years on the throne, and yet was almost never, in any ordinary sense, genuinely alone. Somewhere inside that quiet contradiction is where tonight's whole story lives, and we're going to sit inside it together, slowly, one detail at a time. Just a small moment before we properly begin. If these gentle evenings have become something of a comfort to you, subscribing would mean more than you would think. And if tonight helps carry you a little closer to sleep, a like really does keep this small channel going, tell me in the comments where you're curled up tonight. I love reading every single one message. All right, my friend, let's begin. The Queen of England is walking toward her privy chamber tonight. A short, familiar distance from the public part of the palace, a corridor she has walked more times than anyone could count. The public hours of the day have ended. What she's walking toward is the one set of rooms where she's meant to simply be a woman getting ready for bed. But when the door opens, the room is not empty. It rarely was. Women are already inside, waiting, candles lit, linens warmed. The Queen stepping into a space that is already occupied and will stay occupied, in one form or another, for the rest of the night. Somewhere just beyond the door, a fire is settling in its grate, coals shifting down with a soft collapsing sound. A latch clicks into place further off. Candlelight, beeswax rather than the cheaper tallow that lit most English homes, fills the room with a clean, steady glow, an expense that alone marked these rooms as belonging to royalty, rather than to any ordinary household, however wealthy. The women waiting for her hold specific ranks and specific responsibilities, drawn from the ladies and gentlewomen of the Privy Chamber, positions given to women of good family who did not need the income, and sought the role instead for the access it granted. The kind of proximity to power that most of the English aristocracy would never come close to earning. The exact number in the room on any given evening likely shifted depending on the night and the occasion, but there would almost always have been more than one. Undressing begins quickly, without much ceremony beyond the ceremony already built into the clothing itself. The outer gown is laced with a row of small points threaded through eyelets, each one worked loose by hand, the women moving with the ease of people who have done this together many times before. One eases the sleeves away, pinned on as separate pieces rather than sewn permanently in, a detail of construction that let a single gown effectively become several different outfits depending on which sleeves were attached that day. Another works at the boned bodice, easing free the structure, built from horn or whalebone or in some later garments, thin strips of steel that held a shape the body does not naturally take on its own. Underneath the gown comes the farthingale, that wide-hooped understructure that gave Elizabethan dress its distinctive silhouette. Lifting it away is its own small operation, and once it is gone, the space she occupies seems to shrink, plainer and more ordinary than it was a moment before. The jewellery comes off next, piece by piece, pearls, rings, brooches, whatever headpiece the evening called for. An officer of the wardrobe somewhere nearby would have been responsible for accounting for each item since royal jewels doubled as diplomatic currency and portable wealth as much as personal ornament, and losing track of even one piece carried weight well beyond simple carelessness. Then the cosmetics. By the later decades of her reign, Elizabeth's public face relied on a heavy white paint, sometimes made with white lead mixed into a paste, a look history has come to call the mask of youth. Taking it off meant cloths dampened with rosewater or other washes, worked carefully across skin that had carried the paint since early that morning. Her hair comes down last, or rather her wig does. By her later years she wore elaborate reddish gold wigs regularly, her own hair thinned and greyed well past the point where it could produce that colour on its own. Underneath was simply an older woman's hair. Ordinary in every way except that very few people beyond this particular room ever saw it uncovered. Ambassadors who negotiated with her for years, courtiers who served her for decades. Most of them never knew for certain what her hair actually looked like beneath the version she wore in public. The public Elizabeth, painted, sung about, feared and admired across the courts of Europe, was rebuilt each morning from a series of separate pieces and taken apart again each evening by a small circle of women bound to her by service, discretion, and in some cases what appears to have been genuine personal affection. That undoing never happened without someone else in the room. Beyond the door, members of the yeomen of the guard hold their posts along the corridor, and at the head of the nearest staircase, a body of royal bodyguards maintained throughout her reign, as a visible reminder that access to the monarch was granted, never simply assumed. Their presence was not decoration. Elizabeth spent much of her reign as the target of plots against her life, some of them clumsy and quickly caught, others reported to have come uncomfortably close to succeeding, and the guards reflected a threat that was real rather than performed. The locks on the doors leading toward these rooms received the same serious attention. Surviving household records suggest real care paid to who held keys to which doors and how those keys were tracked, the kind of bureaucratic detail that tells you something about the atmosphere inside this particular household. Safety here was never treated as something that could simply be assumed. It had to be built and rebuilt night after night. Even once the guards were posted and the doors secured, a quieter layer of checking often fell to the women inside the chamber. A look beneath the bed, a glance behind the heavy wall hangings that could easily conceal someone standing still. This was not theatre performed for the Queen's benefit. It reflected years of genuine threat that had trained an entire household to check automatically, the way anyone might check a locked door before bed, less from active fear than from habit worn smooth by repetition. These plots against her life were not rare exceptions in an otherwise calm reign. They recurred throughout her decades on the throne, tied to questions of religion and succession that divided England and much of Europe. We will not dwell on the political details tonight, but the plain fact of that danger sits underneath every locked door and every posted guard, and it helps explain why a woman with this much power still could not simply choose on any given night to be alone. Elizabeth did not dismiss her attendants once she was undressed and settled. Several of her women appear to have slept in the same chamber, or in an adjoining room with a door left open between the two spaces, on truckle beds that could be pulled out from beneath a larger bed or stored against a wall during the day, a common enough fixture in great households of the period. A trusted woman sleeping within reach of the monarch functioned in practical terms as its own kind of security measure, much like the guards posted outside. Night after night this meant the Queen of England could not simply toss and turn in private discomfort, without the real likelihood that someone nearby would stir, would ask quietly if all was well. There was no real version of insomnia here that unfolded in true solitude. We tend to imagine loneliness and lack of privacy as opposites, one caused by isolation, and the other by too much company. Elizabeth's nights held both at once, a woman surrounded by people and still, in the ways that mattered most, alone. This threads through every night we are describing tonight, whether it is named aloud or not. Elizabeth Tudor never shared this bed, or any bed, with a husband. She reigned for 45 years as an unmarried queen, the famous Virgin Queen of English legend, and whatever the private complexities of her emotional life may have actually been, matters historians still debate without any real certainty. The plain and well-documented fact remains simple. No husband ever slept beside her in that curtained bed. No royal consort ever shared these private hours with her the way a king's wife would have shared his. In an age when royal marriage was treated as much as political architecture as personal choice, when nearly every other monarch in Europe had a spouse occupying precisely this kind of intimate nightly space, Elizabeth's bed remained in that specific sense her own, and yet that particular solitude was almost entirely symbolic rather than literal. The absence of a husband did not create true privacy. It simply meant the people occupying the space beside her, watching over her, tending to her comfort through the night, were women bound to her by service and trust rather than marriage. She was alone in the one sense that mattered most to the political anxieties of her age, the question of a king consort, of shared royal authority, of an heir. And she was almost never, in the plainer physical sense, actually by herself, a contradiction that says something true about the particular, limited shape of the freedom she managed to carve out for herself. Let us look properly now at the bed itself, because we have circled it long enough. The frame is oak, heavy and dark, carved along its posts with motifs that shift depending on which palace we happen to be in tonight. Sometimes Tudor roses, sometimes more elaborate strapwork patterns fashionable in the later decades of the century. 4 posts rise toward a canopy called a tester, and from that tester hang curtains, often of rich damask or velvet, sometimes embroidered with silver or gold thread that catches whatever candlelight remains in the room and throws it back in small shifting glints. These curtains were not decorative alone. Drawn fully closed around the bed at night, they created a genuinely enclosed space, a small warm chamber within the larger cold chamber, trapping body heat and keeping out the draughts that no amount of fine architecture could ever fully eliminate from a stone palace in an English winter. Beneath her, the mattress itself would likely have been a feather bed, an enormous cloth casing stuffed with down and feathers, laid atop a firmer understructure, sometimes a mattress of wool or straw, beneath the feather bed proper. The whole arrangement providing a depth and softness that stood in sharp, deliberate contrast to what most of her subjects slept on. An ordinary household of the period, even a reasonably prosperous one, might make do with a straw-filled mattress or a thin wool one, and feathers were a genuine luxury, expensive to source in the quantities required for something this size. The sheets themselves were linen, fine and closely woven, changed with a regularity that itself signalled status, since laundering linens of this quality at this scale required a small dedicated staff of its own, working somewhere else in the palace, a labour almost entirely invisible to the Queen herself the way most labour that supported her comfort remained invisible by careful design. Pillows, plural, several of them, filled again with down, propped her in a position that was not quite fully upright and not quite fully flat, a posture many physicians of the era actively recommended, believing that sleeping too flat encouraged what they called an unhealthy stagnation of the humours, the internal fluids that Tudor medicine believed governed the entire balance of the body. Blankets of wool lay beneath a final coverlet, often the most visually striking layer of the whole bed, sometimes embroidered, sometimes trimmed in fur during the colder months, ermine perhaps, or fox, materials whose very presence on a bed signalled a household operating at the absolute top of what English wealth could provide. And here is a small, quiet detail worth sitting with. For all this extraordinary luxury, the room itself was often genuinely uncomfortably cold. Stone palaces held the chill of an English winter with remarkable stubbornness, and even a well-tended fire in a generous hearth could only do so much against walls that thick. The bed hangings existed as much to solve this practical problem as to display wealth, and there is something almost touching in that overlap. The way the Queen of England, wrapped in fur and fine linen within a bed worth more than most of her subjects would earn across several lifetimes, was still, in the most basic physical sense, doing the same thing every cold sleeper across the kingdom was doing that same night, trying to trap a little warmth against the dark. The fire itself deserves a moment of attention, because it is doing more work in this room than simple warmth. A groom of the chamber, one of the lower-ranking male servants permitted access to the outer edges of the privy apartments, would have built it up earlier in the evening, laid with seasoned oak or ash, chosen deliberately over cheaper, smokier woods, because the smoke from poor fuel had no place in a room this fine. By the hour we're describing now, the flames themselves have mostly settled into a steady bed of glowing coals, throwing a low orange light across the underside of the bed hangings and along the carved wooden panels lining the walls, a light entirely different in quality from the sharper, whiter light of the candles, warmer somehow and slower, the kind of light that makes a room feel like it is breathing rather than simply lit. Listen to what the room actually sounds like at this hour, because sound tells you things that description alone cannot quite manage. A log settles in the grate and sends up a small shower of sparks that die before they land. Somewhere beyond the door, footsteps pass and fade, unhurried, the particular rhythm of a household still faintly awake but winding steadily down. Wind finds whatever gap exists around an old leaded window, however carefully sealed, and produces a low, almost musical note that rises and falls with the gusts outside. A palace this size never falls entirely silent, not even at its quietest hour. There is always, somewhere, a door easing shut, a distant voice pitched low, the settling creak of old timber cooling after a day of use. Elizabeth would have known these sounds the way you know the particular sounds of your own home, so familiar they had likely stopped registering as sound at all, simply the ambient texture of being safely, privately, almost alone. Now something practical and slightly less glamorous than everything we have covered so far, though no less real for that. Even the Queen's linens had to contend with the same small, persistent annoyances that troubled every household of the period, regardless of wealth. Fleas, moths, the general low-grade presence of pests that Tudor housekeeping fought constantly and never entirely won against. Sweet herbs, lavender chief among them, along with rosemary and dried rose petals, were regularly laid among the linens and within the bed hangings themselves, partly for the pleasant scent they lent the room, and partly in the genuine, if only partially effective, hope that certain fragrant plants discouraged the insects that plagued even the finest households. The linens were changed with a frequency that far outpaced what an ordinary family could manage, a small army of laundresses working elsewhere in the palace to keep a continuous rotation of fresh, sweet-smelling sheets moving through the royal apartments. But changed frequently is not the same as immune entirely, and there is something quietly grounding in knowing that even Elizabeth Tudor, wrapped in silk and fur within the grandest bed in England, occasionally lay awake scratching at some small itch in the dark, exactly the way anyone else in the kingdom might that same night. Before the curtains are finally drawn closed around her, there is prayer. Elizabeth was, by every surviving account, a genuinely devout woman within the particular, carefully balanced form of English Protestantism she herself had done so much to shape and stabilize during her reign, and her private nightly prayers were not simply a public performance staged for the benefit of watching attendants. She is known to have composed prayers of her own, some of which survive today in her own hand. Written in a mixture of English and other languages she commanded fluently, Latin, French, Italian, a woman whose education had been extraordinary even by the standards of royal children, and whose private devotional writing shows a mind still actively, restlessly engaged with questions of faith, mortality, and duty even at the close of an exhausting day. Picture her kneeling briefly at a small prayer cushion kept near the bed, or simply sitting upright against the pillows, hands folded, the room quiet enough now that her own low voice is the only sound apart from the fire's occasional settling. The women nearby would have understood this as private time in the truest sense available to her, a moment where even their presence, though unavoidable, was treated with a kind of respectful distance, eyes lowered, conversation stilled. This is perhaps, I think, the closest Elizabeth came, on an ordinary night, to genuine solitude. Not physical solitude, which was rarely available to her in any complete form, but a kind of internal privacy, a space inside her own thoughts that no attendant, however loyal, could actually enter. Letters sometimes came even at this hour, particularly during periods of political crisis, and there were many such periods across a 45-year reign. A messenger arriving late with urgent news from the continent, from Scotland, from wherever the latest concern happened to be centred that season, was not unheard of, and Elizabeth was famously reluctant to leave important correspondence entirely unread until morning, a habit that speaks to both her formidable work ethic and to a mind that seemed, throughout her life, unusually resistant to simply switching off. She might read by a single candle brought close to the bed, her handwriting afterward on any reply sometimes noticeably less careful than her daytime correspondence, the small tells of genuine tiredness creeping into ink strokes, made at an hour when a queen, like anyone else, simply wanted to be done for the day. And sleep itself did not always come easily, particularly as the years accumulated behind her. Contemporary accounts and the observations of physicians attending her in later decades describe periods of genuine insomnia, nights where the Queen was known to be restless, unable to settle, her mind still turning over the day's business or the next day's dangers, long after her body had been prepared for rest in every physical sense available to Tudor comfort. This should not surprise us, perhaps. The particular arithmetic of her position, constant political calculation, the ever-present awareness of threat, the weight of decisions that could genuinely alter the course of a nation, does not simply switch off because the candles have been dimmed and the curtains drawn. Some nights, by every indication we have, Elizabeth Tudor lay awake in that magnificent bed for a very long while, thinking, the way any of us might lie awake thinking, except that her particular thoughts carried a weight that few people in history have ever had to carry alone, in the dark, waiting for a sleep that refused to arrive on command. Age changed all of this, gradually and then, in her final years, quite noticeably. Elizabeth came to the throne as a young woman of 25, and she would reign for 45 years, which means the Queen whose bedtime rituals we open tonight's story with, at the height of her power in her 30s and 40s, is not quite the same woman we find in the record during her final decade. In 1592, when she was well into her 50s, her sleep patterns are described by those closest to her as increasingly troubled, marked by wakefulness that concerned her physicians and by a general restlessness that seemed to deepen alongside the genuine political pressures of a reign now entering its later, more uncertain years. War with Spain still unresolved, questions of succession growing steadily more urgent as it became clear the Virgin Queen would leave no direct heir of her own body. There had been an illness decades earlier, in 1562, that shaped the rest of her life in ways that connect directly to everything we have already discussed tonight. A serious bout of smallpox nearly killed her, and though she recovered, the disease left its mark on her skin, faint scarring that the elaborate cosmetic mask we described earlier existed in part to conceal. That single illness, survived in her 20s, echoes forward through every single night of careful, ritualized preparation we have walked through so far. The white paint, the careful candle-lit removal each evening, the private face beneath the public one. A young woman's brush with death, quietly reshaping the nightly habits of a queen for the following 4 decades. By her late 60s, the final years of her long reign, contemporary observers describe a woman whose physical vigour had visibly declined, though her mental sharpness by most accounts remained remarkably intact almost to the very end. She is recorded as pacing at night rather than sleeping, restless in a way her attendants found genuinely concerning, sometimes refusing to be put to bed at her usual hour, standing for long stretches near the fire rather than settling beneath the covers her women had carefully warmed and arranged. There is something quietly devastating in this image if you sit with it. The most carefully guarded, most attended, most physically comfortable sleeping arrangement available to any woman in England, and still, in the end, sleep itself proved to be the one thing that could not simply be commanded to arrive on schedule, could not be secured by guards or purchased with fine linen, could not be arranged by even the most devoted attendant standing ready in the shadows of the room. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. All that architecture of comfort and security we have spent so long describing tonight, and still, some nights none of it was quite enough. The body and the mind, in the end, answer to their own private logic, indifferent to rank, indifferent to the number of guards posted in the corridor outside. Now let us slow down here for a moment and step outside the walls of a single palace entirely, because Elizabeth's nights did not all unfold within the familiar comfort of Whitehall or Greenwich or Hampton Court, the great fixed royal residences most people picture when they imagine her world. For roughly 2 to 3 months of nearly every summer across her long reign, the Queen and a substantial portion of her court left London behind entirely and travelled through the English countryside in what became known as a royal progress. a moving procession of monarch, courtiers, servants, and an almost unimaginable quantity of baggage, stopping for days or weeks at a time at the grand houses of noblemen wealthy enough and ambitious enough to host her. And here is the detail that tends to genuinely astonish people. Being chosen to host the Queen during a progress was simultaneously the highest honour a nobleman could receive, and quite often a financial catastrophe waiting to happen. A single visit could cost a host thousands of pounds, a truly staggering sum by the standards of the day, spent on elaborate entertainments, new furnishings, extraordinary quantities of food, and, just as importantly, on suitable accommodations fit for a monarch who expected, wherever she slept, an approximation of the comfort and security she maintained within her own permanent palaces. Noble families sometimes spent years recovering from the expense of a single royal visit, and yet the alternative, being passed over entirely, carried its own quiet danger, a signal of declining royal favour that could prove costlier still in the long run. So picture it now, a different kind of night entirely from the one we opened tonight's story with. Elizabeth arriving at some grand country house, perhaps one she has visited before, perhaps one entirely new to her, and being shown to what is, for the duration of her stay, effectively her bedchamber, a room the host has likely spent considerable money and even more anxious effort preparing in the weeks beforehand. Fine hangings brought in specially, sometimes transported along with the royal household itself, rather than trusted to whatever the house already possessed. A bed suitable for a queen, sometimes purpose-built or purpose-acquired for the occasion, because no ambitious nobleman wanted it whispered afterward that the queen had slept on furniture beneath her station. The same women who attended her nightly in London travelled with her on progress, ensuring that even in an unfamiliar house, in an unfamiliar county, the actual ritual of preparing for bed remained comfortingly, deliberately identical. Security, too, travelled with her, arguably mattering even more on progress than within the walls of a fortified royal palace. An unfamiliar house, however grand, however loyal its owners, presented risks that Whitehall's long-established routines had learned to manage almost invisibly. Guards were posted according to careful, practiced arrangement wherever she stayed, doors identified and secured, the same quiet checking of hidden spaces that we described earlier, carried out fresh in every single new location, night after night, county after county, for the full length of a summer's travelling. There is something almost exhausting simply to imagine this constant reconstruction of safety and comfort in house after house, and yet by every account it became, over the decades, simply another version of routine, another set of motions so practiced by Elizabeth's household that even genuine unfamiliarity could be smoothed over into something approaching the ordinary. Among the women who moved through this nightly world with her, one name recurs throughout the historical record more than any other in the earlier decades of her life, and she deserves a moment of her own here. Kat Ashley had been Elizabeth's governess since childhood, long before there was any expectation the young princess would ever wear a crown at all, and she remained one of the Queen's closest attendants well into the reign itself, eventually holding the most senior position among her ladies of the bedchamber. Theirs was not simply an employer and servant relationship in any ordinary sense. Kat Ashley had known Elizabeth as a frightened, uncertain girl during years when the crown seemed anything but guaranteed, had cared for her through genuine political danger during the reign of her sister Mary, when Elizabeth herself was briefly imprisoned and her life hung in real uncertainty. That history does not simply vanish once a person becomes queen. It settles into the relationship and stays there. So when we picture those nightly hours, the undressing, the quiet conversation, the small rituals of comfort and preparation, it is worth remembering that at least one of the women present, for much of Elizabeth's reign, was someone who had known her since before any of this grandeur existed at all, who had likely seen her cry as a child, who understood something of the private woman beneath the constructed queen that almost nobody else at court, however senior, could genuinely claim to understand. There is real comfort in that thought, I think, tucked in among everything else we have discussed tonight. Even within a life this thoroughly surrounded, this endlessly observed, there existed pockets of relationship that were not merely functional, not merely political, but something closer to genuine old affection, carried quietly across decades. Kat Ashley died in 1565, roughly 7 years into Elizabeth's reign, and by every account the Queen mourned her with a depth of feeling that surprised even those close to her, a grief that seemed to cut through the careful, controlled emotional register Elizabeth generally maintained in public. It is a small human detail easy to lose amid the grander sweep of politics and war and succession that dominates most retellings of this reign, and yet it belongs here, I think, in a story specifically about her private hours, because grief like that does not confine itself neatly to daylight. It would have followed her into these very rooms, into these very nights, for a long while afterward, one more quiet, invisible weight carried alongside everything else. Let us stay now in the deep middle of the night, the hour when the palace has settled about as fully as it ever settles, and consider what actually happens while the Queen sleeps, or tries to. The yeomen of the guard posted in the corridors did not stand motionless for 8 unbroken hours. Watches were arranged in shifts, a practical necessity for maintaining genuine alertness across a long night, and the changing of one set of guards for another followed its own quiet, practiced choreography. Footsteps arriving, a low exchange of words, footsteps departing, the whole transition designed to happen with as little disturbance to the sleeping household as possible. A careful listener within the Queen's chamber, lying awake in the dark the way we know she sometimes was, would have learnt to recognise this particular rhythm of changing footsteps, the way a person today might unconsciously register the sound of a heating system cycling on and off overnight, present, expected, ultimately reassuring rather than disruptive. Candles were managed carefully through these hours as well, and this detail matters more than it might first appear. Burning every candle in a room throughout an entire night represented an unnecessary expense, even within a royal household that could easily afford it, and more importantly, an unwatched flame posed a genuine fire risk in buildings constructed substantially of timber, hung with fabric, and filled with the particular flammable clutter of a well-furnished 16th century interior. Typically, most candles would be extinguished once the Queen was settled for the night, leaving perhaps a single small light burning low, sometimes a simple rushlight or a carefully trimmed candle set at a safe distance from any hanging fabric. Enough illumination that a waking attendant could move about the room without stumbling, not enough to actually banish the darkness the Queen was meant to be sleeping within. This meant that for the deepest hours of the night, the chamber existed in something close to true darkness, broken only by the low orange glow of the settling fire and whatever thin light might filter faintly around the edges of heavy curtains from a moon outside, when weather and season permitted a moon at all. It is worth remembering how genuinely dark the world was before artificial light became something we could simply summon at will. Even within the wealthiest household in England, night meant something closer to true night than most of us, accustomed to streetlights and glowing phone screens, could easily picture without real effort. Elizabeth's eyes, like everyone else's in this period, would have adjusted to a darkness deeper and more complete than almost anything we encounter in an ordinary evening today, a darkness with its own particular texture, its own quality of stillness. The season shaped all of this considerably, and it is worth pausing on the difference for a moment, because a summer night at Greenwich, with its long pale twilight lingering well past 9 in the evening and birdsong beginning again absurdly early the following morning, felt like an entirely different world from a January night at Whitehall, when full darkness arrived by mid-afternoon and the cold pressed in against even the thickest stone walls with a persistence no fire could fully answer. Winter nights meant more attention paid to the fire, more frequent checking that it had not burned down too far, extra layers of fur and wool added to the bed's already considerable warmth. Summer nights, paradoxically, sometimes proved harder for genuine rest, warmer air trapped within heavy curtained beds designed primarily to solve the opposite problem. Windows perhaps cracked slightly despite the security concerns this introduced, a small compromise between comfort and caution that shifted, season by season, according to whichever discomfort currently felt more pressing. Greenwich itself deserves a moment here, because it held a particular place in Elizabeth's own history quite apart from its role as one of several royal residences she used throughout her reign. She had been born there, in the palace that once stood on that same stretch of riverbank, and there is something gently striking in this, a woman who spent her entire adult life moving between grand houses she did not build, and rooms furnished according to centuries of accumulated royal tradition, occasionally slept within sight of the very spot where her own life had begun. Whether she thought about this consciously on any given night, we cannot know with any certainty, and I will not pretend otherwise. But the palace itself remained a constant across the whole span of her reign, weathering the same seasons, hosting the same rituals of undressing and settling and guarding, decade after decade, a kind of quiet architectural continuity running beneath the constantly shifting business of her public life. There is a particular summer worth pausing on specifically, because it illustrates better than almost anything else how thoroughly the day's business could follow a monarch into these supposedly private hours. In the summer of 1588, England faced what may have been the single greatest existential threat of Elizabeth's entire reign. A vast Spanish fleet, the Armada, sailing toward English shores with the explicit aim of ending both her rule and the religious settlement she had spent 3 decades carefully building. For weeks that summer, news arrived at court in fragments, some of it encouraging, much of it uncertain, occasionally alarming, and it is genuinely difficult to imagine that the careful, practiced calm of her nightly rituals remained entirely untouched by the weight of what was unfolding along the English coast. Picture those particular nights specifically, the same women moving through the same familiar motions, the gown unlaced, the jewels accounted for, the wig lifted away, and underneath all of it, a queen whose mind must surely have been circling again and again around questions that no amount of practiced routine could fully quiet. Reports would have come at unusual hours during a crisis of this magnitude, messengers arriving later than protocol normally permitted, the ordinary rhythm of the evening interrupted by news that could not, given the stakes involved, simply wait politely until morning. And still, even amid genuine national emergency, the fundamental shape of the night held. The guards were posted, the fire was tended, the bed was warmed. Whatever storm of anxiety moved through her private thoughts, the physical architecture of her nightly safety and comfort continued exactly as it always had, a kind of stubborn, practiced continuity that must have offered its own quiet form of steadiness even during the most uncertain days of her entire reign. The Armada, as history remembers, was ultimately defeated, scattered by a combination of English naval tactics and brutal weather that did as much damage to the Spanish fleet as any English cannon managed. And somewhere in the days following that news finally reaching London with real confirmation, there would have been a night, one specific ordinary night among all the others, when Elizabeth settled into this same bed, carrying a weight genuinely lifted rather than added, the particular, bone-deep relief of a danger that had passed, rather than one still gathering somewhere unseen. We do not have a detailed account of that specific evening, and I will not pretend we do. But it is worth imagining anyway, I think. This same familiar room, the same familiar rituals, made subtly different by the simple fact of survival, the way an ordinary evening feels different after news that something feared has finally, mercifully, resolved itself. Now let us return to the more ordinary rhythm of things, because most nights, of course, carried nothing so dramatic. Most nights were simply nights, the accumulated small business of an ordinary reign settling quietly into rest. One evening indistinguishable in its essential shape from the hundreds that came before, and the hundreds that would follow. And there is something worth appreciating in that ordinariness too, the sheer repetition of it across 45 years, the same undressing, the same prayers, the same careful checking of doors and shadows, performed so many thousands of times that it must have become, eventually, something closer to breathing than to conscious ritual at all. There is a popular story that circulates about Elizabethan bathing, the claim that she bathed only once a month whether she needed it or not, a line often repeated as though it were settled historical fact. I want to be honest with you about something here. That particular quote does not actually hold up well under close scrutiny, and most serious historians treat it as apocryphal, a colourful line that attached itself to her reputation long after her death, rather than anything reliably documented from the period itself. The genuine historical picture is considerably less dramatic and, frankly, more interesting. Elizabeth is recorded as bathing with reasonable regularity by the standards of her own era, using a portable bathing tub that could be brought into her chambers and filled with water carried and heated by servants working elsewhere in the palace. A labour-intensive process that meant a full immersive bath remained a genuine occasion rather than a daily habit, but an occasion that occurred with more frequency than popular myth generally credits her with. Between these fuller baths, daily hygiene relied heavily on washing at a basin, warm water and fine linen cloths used to clean the face, hands, and other exposed areas each morning and evening, a routine not so different in its basic logic from what many of us still practice today, even if the specific tools and expectations have changed considerably. Sweet-scented waters, rose water again, or orange flower water were commonly used both for washing and simply for freshening linens and clothing between full launderings, part of a broader Tudor preoccupation with pleasant scent as both a genuine sensory pleasure and a practical defense against the less pleasant smells that inevitably accumulated in any household of the period, royal or otherwise. Elizabeth's own personal scent preferences are documented in various household accounts, and there is something quietly humanizing in picturing this, a queen with particular, specific preferences about how she wanted to smell, favoring certain floral and herbal combinations over others, a small vanity entirely recognizable across the centuries separating her world from ours. The nightgown itself, once the day's formal clothing had come away entirely, was typically a simple linen shift, far plainer than anything worn during daylight hours, sometimes trimmed with a small amount of lace or embroidery at the neck and cuffs, but fundamentally a garment built for comfort rather than display. This transition from the elaborately constructed public silhouette we described earlier to this simple, soft, unadorned linen shift represents perhaps the single clearest physical marker of the boundary between Elizabeth's public and private selves, a boundary crossed nightly, always in the same handful of trusted rooms, always in front of the same handful of trusted women. There is something almost meditative in the repetition of it, the way any deeply ingrained ritual becomes, eventually, less about the individual actions themselves and more about the accumulated comfort of familiar sequence, one step reliably following another, the body settling into a pattern the mind barely needs to consciously direct anymore. Music entered these private hours too, more often than you might expect, and it is worth lingering here for a while, because this is exactly the kind of detail suited to where we are in the night now. Elizabeth was an accomplished musician in her own right, known to play the virginals, a small keyboard instrument popular among the educated aristocracy of the period, with genuine skill rather than merely the polite competence expected of a well-raised noblewoman. On certain evenings, before the final settling into bed, she might play for a while herself, the small, bright, plucked notes of the instrument filling the outer chamber, a private performance for an audience of perhaps 3 or 4 women who had by this point in their service likely heard her play the same handful of favoured pieces countless times before, and who understood without being told that this quiet hour of music belonged to her, a small pocket of the evening reserved for something that was neither state business nor ceremonial duty, simply pleasure, chosen freely, for its own sake. Court musicians, too, were sometimes brought in for gentler evening performances, a lute player perhaps, summoned to sit in the outer room and play something soft and unhurried while the Queen prepared for bed in the chamber beyond, music functioning here almost exactly the way we might use it today, a deliberate tool for easing the transition from the alert, engaged mind of daytime business into the slower, quieter register required for actual rest. There is genuine continuity in that, I think something worth noticing. 400 and some years separate that lute player's careful, unhurried playing from whatever quiet sound might be helping you settle tonight, and yet the underlying human impulse driving both is essentially identical, the recognition that certain sounds, played softly at the right hour, can coax a restless mind towards stillness in a way that simple silence sometimes cannot manage on its own. Reading, too, filled some portion of these final waking hours, and Elizabeth's reading habits throughout her life were genuinely remarkable by any standard, royal or otherwise. She read fluently in multiple languages, maintained a real and lasting interest in classical literature throughout her adult life, and is recorded as continuing to translate classical texts, Boethius among them, well into her later years, a habit of disciplined intellectual engagement that persisted even as her body grew increasingly tired with age. Picture her, on some quieter evenings, propped against those down-filled pillows with a small book held close to a single candle, working slowly through a passage of Latin or Greek for the simple private pleasure of the exercise itself. Entirely unwatched in any meaningful sense despite the women nearby, because nobody in that room could actually follow along with what her mind was doing as it moved through language and ideas that belonged, in that particular moment, entirely to her. This detail matters more than it might first seem, and it circles back to something we touched on earlier tonight. If true privacy for Elizabeth existed anywhere within these carefully attended, constantly witnessed hours, it existed here, in the interior space of her own thinking, in the specific books she chose to read for her own reasons, in the particular musical pieces she favoured without needing to explain her preferences to anyone. The body remained visible, tended, watched over by loyal and necessary company every single night of her adult reigning life, but the mind, in these particular quiet pockets of the evening, retained something closer to genuine sovereignty, a small kingdom that no guard, however loyal, could actually enter uninvited. Each of her palaces held its own particular character, its own version of this nightly world, and it is worth walking briefly through a few of them, because the Queen's nights were never quite as fixed and singular as it might be easy to assume from everything we have described so far. Hampton Court, sprawling and immense along the Thames, carried a slightly different atmosphere from Whitehall, its state apartments arranged with an almost theatrical grandeur inherited from Cardinal Wolsey's original ambitions for the palace before it ever passed into royal hands. The Privy Chamber there sat within a suite of rooms that had been expanded and elaborated across successive Tudor reigns, each monarch adding their own layer of decoration and modification, so that sleeping there meant sleeping within a space that carried, quite literally built into its walls, the accumulated history of her father and grandfather before her. Whitehall, by contrast, functioned as the true administrative heart of her government, an enormous, sprawling complex of buildings that had grown organically over decades rather than following any single unified design, meaning her private chambers there existed within a genuine warren of connected structures, corridors leading to more corridors, a physical labyrinth that mirrored, in its own way, the complexity of the political machinery operating throughout its rooms during daylight hours. Nights at Whitehall likely carried a particular quality of proximity to ongoing business that the more purely residential palaces lacked, council papers perhaps still within easy reach, messengers more likely to arrive given the palace's role as the genuine operational centre of the kingdom. Richmond Palace held a different significance again, a favoured residence in her later years, valued for qualities that mattered increasingly as she aged, a gentler location along the river, somewhat removed from the greater bustle of central London, praised by contemporaries for the healthfulness of its air, a real consideration in an age when the closer, more crowded conditions of a city centre were genuinely, correctly associated with illness and disease. It was at Richmond, in March of 1603, that Elizabeth's final illness took hold, and it was in a bedchamber within that same palace, attended as ever by women who had served her for years, that her long reign finally came to its end. There is something fitting, perhaps, in how a woman who spent 45 years of nights surrounded by careful, devoted attendants met her own final hours in essentially the same arrangement, familiar women nearby, familiar rituals of care continuing even as the woman at their centre prepared, this final time, for a rest from which she would not be woken each morning and transformed back into a public self. I do not want to dwell too long or too heavily on that ending tonight, because it is not really where this particular story wants to sit for very long, and there is something almost disrespectful, I think, in rushing toward a queen's death, simply because it makes for a dramatic closing note. Elizabeth's final illness and passing deserve their own careful telling on some other night, told with the full weight and context they warrant. What I want you to hold on to instead, from this brief mention, is simply the continuity of it, the way the fundamental shape of her nights, women nearby, careful attention paid to comfort and safety, remained essentially unchanged from the vigorous young queen of the 1560s all the way through to her final weeks, a single unbroken thread running the entire length of an extraordinary reign. Let us talk for a moment about who was not allowed into these rooms, because the boundaries of access tell you just as much about this world as the people who were granted entry. Ambition at the Elizabethan court very often expressed itself as a quiet, relentless campaign for proximity, and the privy chamber represented the innermost circle of a series of concentric rings of access that structured the entire physical geography of royal life. Beyond the Great Hall, where almost anyone with legitimate business at court might pass through, lay the presence chamber, where the Queen received visitors formally, seated beneath a canopy of estate, a room designed explicitly for display and ceremony. Beyond that lay the privy chamber itself, access to which was tightly restricted to a genuinely small number of trusted individuals, and beyond that, finally, the bedchamber we have spent tonight exploring, the innermost and most restricted space of all. Powerful men at court, earls and secretaries of state, and ambitious younger courtiers hungry for advancement, understood with real clarity that influence flowed not simply from official title, but from proximity, from being the person who happened to be present when the Queen was in a receptive, relaxed mood, from having genuine access to her unguarded private moments rather than only her carefully managed public appearances. And yet the bedchamber itself, the space we have focused on tonight, remained almost entirely a female domain. Male courtiers, however senior, however trusted in matters of state, simply did not enter this particular room under ordinary circumstances. This was not incidental. It reflected both practical considerations around modesty and propriety, and a deeper structural reality about where genuine intimate trust was permitted to exist within this court, a boundary that even the most powerful men in England understood they could not cross, regardless of rank, regardless of years of loyal service in every other arena of royal life. This meant that the women of the privy chamber and bedchamber held a particular, somewhat underappreciated form of political significance throughout Elizabeth's reign, a significance historians have increasingly recognised in recent decades after generations of accounts that focused almost entirely on the men surrounding her. These women heard things, observed moods, understood the Queen's private state of mind in ways that even her most senior male advisers, men like Burghley or later Cecil's own son Robert, simply could not access directly. A request passed through the right lady of the bedchamber, timed to reach the Queen during a genuinely relaxed private moment, might succeed where the same request, delivered formally in the presence chamber, would have met a cooler reception. Historians studying petitions and patronage networks from this period have found real evidence of exactly this kind of quiet, informal influence operating alongside the official machinery of government. A second, less visible channel of power running through precisely the rooms we have spent tonight exploring. Now, as the years of her reign accumulated, a particular anxiety began to shadow these private hours more and more persistently, one that had nothing to do with fire or intruders or ordinary insomnia, and everything to do with the fundamental uncertainty hanging over the entire kingdom. Elizabeth had no direct heir, no child of her own body who might inherit the throne, and as she moved through her 50s and into her 60s without that situation changing, the question of succession grew from a distant theoretical concern into something considerably closer and more pressing. Council meetings addressed it. Ambassadors from foreign courts probed at it constantly in their dispatches home, and it is difficult to imagine that a queen this politically astute, this famously sharp in her understanding of exactly how fragile dynastic stability could prove, did not carry some measure of that weight with her into these very private hours we have spent tonight exploring. She famously, and for many years, refused to name a successor outright, a deliberate political strategy that preserved her own authority by preventing courtiers from prematurely aligning themselves with whoever might come next, but a strategy that also meant she alone, more than almost anyone else in the kingdom, held the full weight of that unresolved question, night after night for years on end. Let us slow all the way down now, because we have covered a great deal of ground tonight, and there is a particular hour still ahead of us that deserves nothing but stillness. It is somewhere past 2 in the morning. The fire has burnt down to little more than a faint orange glow beneath a soft layer of grey ash, still giving off warmth but no real light of its own anymore. The single small candle left burning has grown short in its holder, its flame steady now rather than flickering, the way flame settles once a room has gone truly quiet around it. Beyond the heavy drawn curtains of the bed, the world has narrowed to almost nothing, a small warm enclosed darkness holding one sleeping woman and whatever thoughts still moved through her mind before sleep finally, eventually claimed her. In the outer part of the chamber, one of her women lies on a truckle bed pulled close, breathing slow and even, genuinely asleep now after the long day's duties, though some deep practiced part of her attention remains faintly alert even in sleep, the particular light readiness that develops in anyone whose work requires them to wake instantly if truly needed. This is its own quiet skill, cultivated across years of service, the ability to rest deeply enough to actually recover, while some small watchful thread of awareness never fully switches off. It is not so different, perhaps, from the particular alertness a parent develops toward a sleeping child, present even in unconsciousness, ready to surface the moment it matters. Outside in the corridor, a guard shifts his weight slightly, the soft creak of leather and the faint scrape of a boot against old flooring sounds so quiet and so habitual by this hour that they barely register as sound at all anymore, simply the ambient texture of a night proceeding exactly as it should. Somewhere further off, a door closes with the particular soft finality of a household that has for the most part gone to sleep, the last few wakeful souls, kitchen staff perhaps preparing for the earliest tasks of the coming morning, moving through their duties in low voices and careful footsteps that will not carry this far. And here, in this deep, quiet hour, is perhaps the truest version of everything we have been circling around tonight. Not the grand ceremony of the undressing, not the careful political calculation of access and influence, not even the genuine danger that necessitated all this careful nightly guarding in the first place. Just this: a woman asleep, or trying to be, in a warm bed within a cold stone room, surrounded by people whose entire purpose in this particular hour reduces down to the simplest possible task, keeping her safe and comfortable until morning comes. Strip away every layer of crown and title and political consequence, and what remains is something almost startlingly ordinary, the same basic human arrangement that has repeated itself in one form or another across every era and every culture, someone watching over someone else through the vulnerable hours of the night. I find something genuinely moving in that reduction. Honestly, the way all the elaborate architecture of monarchy, all the ceremony and danger and careful political maneuvering we have spent tonight exploring, ultimately rests on something as simple and as old as a person needing to feel safe enough to actually close their eyes. Elizabeth Tudor commanded an empire's worth of resources and attention, and in the end, what all of that bought her, on an ordinary Tuesday night deep in the 16th century, was essentially the same thing any of us might want on any ordinary night of our own lives: warmth, quiet, someone nearby who cared whether she woke safely the next morning. The scale of everything around her was extraordinary. The actual human need at the centre of it was not extraordinary at all. Before we drift further into the deepest part of the night, let us return briefly to something practical, because even the most private, most intimate hours of Elizabeth's world remained tethered to an enormous machinery of administration operating quietly just beyond her chamber walls. The jewels removed earlier in the evening did not simply sit in a drawer somewhere. They were carried, under careful watch, to secure storage within the palace, sometimes to the jewel house proper if the palace possessed one, sometimes to a strong room maintained specifically for the royal wardrobe's most valuable contents, logged by officers whose entire professional lives revolved around the careful custodianship of royal property. This was a genuine department of government in its way, staffed by men and women whose names rarely appear in the grander histories of the period, and whose work nonetheless kept the entire elaborate apparatus of royal display functioning smoothly, night after night, year after year. The gown itself, once removed, required its own careful handling. Fine fabrics of this quality, velvet, silk, cloth of gold or silver thread, worked through elaborate embroidery, could not simply be tossed over a chair the way a person today might discard an evening's clothing. Garments were carefully folded or hung according to methods designed to prevent the kind of creasing and wear that would shorten their usable life, sometimes wrapped in protective cloth, sometimes laid flat with tissue or linen between layers of delicate fabric. A single one of Elizabeth's formal gowns, by some estimates from surviving wardrobe accounts, might represent months of skilled labour from embroiderers, tailors, and other specialists, an investment of both money and craftsmanship that made careful preservation a genuine practical necessity rather than mere fussy perfectionism. Her wardrobe as a whole, by the time of her death, is recorded as containing an almost staggering number of gowns, some historical estimates placing the figure in the many hundreds, a collection so extensive that its proper management required a small dedicated staff working full-time simply to maintain, repair, and track this enormous accumulated inventory of royal clothing. Each gown removed at the end of an evening, like the one we have been describing tonight, rejoined this vast collection, cleaned or aired as needed, ready to be called upon again whenever occasion required. A garment's individual life measured not in single wearings, but in years, sometimes decades, of careful reuse and periodic alteration as fashions shifted and the Queen's own body changed with age. There is something worth noticing in this too, I think, this quiet, unglamorous machinery of maintenance running beneath every single glamorous public appearance we associate with Elizabeth's image. The famous portraits, the elaborate ruffs and jewelled bodices that have become almost shorthand for an entire historical era, depended entirely on this invisible, ongoing labour of careful storage and repair and cleaning, performed by people whose names history has almost entirely forgotten, working in rooms far removed from the grandeur their labour made possible. It is the same pattern we touched on earlier tonight, regarding the women who dressed her, competence and skill operating almost entirely out of sight, essential to an image that depended on appearing effortless. Foreign ambassadors stationed at the English court, particularly those representing Spain and France during the tense diplomatic decades of Elizabeth's reign, took a genuinely surprising level of interest in reporting details of her health and daily habits back to their home governments, and some of what survives in their dispatches offers small unexpected windows into exactly the kind of private details we have spent tonight exploring. An ambassador's report noting that the Queen had seemed unusually tired at a recent audience, or had cancelled a planned appearance citing poor rest the previous night, was not simply idle gossip. In an age when a monarch's personal health carried enormous political weight, when the entire stability of a kingdom's foreign policy might shift dramatically depending on whether its ruler was expected to live another decade or another year, these small domestic observations became genuine intelligence, gathered and analysed with real seriousness by governments across Europe. This meant that Elizabeth's sleep, her appetite, her general vigour from week to week, existed under a kind of watchful international attention that extended far beyond the practical concerns of her own household staff. Spanish and French diplomats alike maintained networks of contacts within the English court, specifically tasked with gathering exactly this sort of personal detail, and reports of the Queen appearing pale, or complaining of poor rest, or recovering slowly from some minor illness, made their way into official correspondence, read by kings and their closest advisers hundreds of miles away. There is something almost dizzying in that scale, when you actually stop to consider it properly. A restless night's sleep, an ordinary human experience shared by essentially everyone who has ever lived, could, in Elizabeth's particular case, become a data point analysed by foreign governments weighing questions of war and peace. Tudor medicine, meanwhile, offered its own particular approach to the problem of poor sleep, rooted in the humoral theory that dominated European medical thinking for centuries, the belief that health depended on maintaining proper balance among four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each associated with particular qualities of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. A physician attending Elizabeth during a period of documented insomnia might recommend dietary adjustments intended to cool an excess of caloric heat believed to be disrupting her rest, alongside herbal remedies drawn from a pharmacopoeia that, while lacking our modern understanding of pharmacology, nonetheless included plants we would still recognize today as having genuine calming properties: chamomile, valerian, lavender prepared as a tisane or incorporated into a small pillow tucked near her own. These remedies persisted for centuries precisely because enough people found genuine relief in them to keep the tradition alive, regardless of whether the underlying humoral theory explaining their supposed effects held up to later scientific scrutiny. Her later years brought a specific, well-documented physical complaint that likely contributed to more than a few difficult nights, and it is a wonderfully human detail worth including here precisely because it is so mundane. Elizabeth suffered from dental problems that worsened considerably as she aged, and by most contemporary accounts was reluctant, for a very long time, to have a troublesome tooth actually extracted, an understandable hesitation in an age when dental extraction was performed without anesthesia and carried genuine risk of serious infection. The pain from an untreated dental problem does not politely confine itself to daylight hours. It is entirely reasonable to imagine, and several historical accounts suggest directly, that toothache contributed meaningfully to periods of poor sleep during her later years, a small, ordinary, thoroughly relatable source of nighttime discomfort, sitting alongside all the grander political anxieties we have already discussed tonight. There is something almost comforting in that particular detail, honestly. The Queen of England, 45 years into an extraordinary reign, kept awake some nights by exactly the same kind of tooth pain that has kept ordinary people from every era, including quite possibly you, tossing and turning long past when sleep should reasonably have arrived. Let us drift back into the room again now, because there is more to notice here if we simply slow down and look carefully. The walls of Elizabeth's bedchamber, wherever we happen to find ourselves tonight, were rarely bare stone left exposed to view. Wood panelling, often oak, sometimes elaborately carved with linen fold patterns that mimicked the soft folds of hanging fabric, covered much of the lower wall, while the upper portions might be hung with tapestries, woven scenes depicting classical mythology or biblical stories, chosen as much for the genuine insulating warmth they provided against cold stone as for their considerable artistic and symbolic value. A tapestry of real quality represented an enormous investment, sometimes taking a workshop of skilled weavers a full year or more to complete a single large piece, and the royal collection Elizabeth inherited and expanded throughout her reign, numbered in the hundreds, rotated periodically between different palaces and different rooms according to season and occasion. At night, by the low light of a single dying candle, these tapestries would have taken on a different character entirely from their daytime appearance, their woven figures softened into vague shapes and shifting shadows rather than the crisp, detailed scenes visible under full daylight. A hunting scene perhaps, or some episode from classical history, reduced by darkness to little more than suggestion, the eye filling in details memory already knew were there. There is something almost dreamlike in that transformation, the way the same fixed image could feel entirely different depending on the hour, the same room somehow becoming a slightly different room, once true darkness settled properly over it. The floor beneath the bed, wherever stone gave way to something warmer, was likely covered with rush matting or, in the Queen's own most private rooms, actual woven carpets, an extravagance still relatively rare even among wealthy households of the period, where carpets more often served as table coverings displayed for visual effect than as something to be walked upon. Underfoot warmth mattered considerably in rooms this large, with ceilings this high, where cold air naturally pooled and settled regardless of how vigorously a fire burned in the hearth. A woman rising in the night, perhaps to use a close stool kept discreetly nearby, perhaps simply restless and needing to move, would have felt that difference immediately, the relative warmth of woven fibre against bare feet compared to the lingering chill of stone flooring elsewhere in the palace. And here, gently, we should acknowledge something practical that belongs in any honest account of how a person actually lived through a night in this period, however much popular imagination prefers to skip past it. Sanitary arrangements within the royal bedchamber relied on the close stool, an enclosed seat containing a chamber pot, sometimes quite elaborately constructed and upholstered for a monarch's use, positioned discreetly within reach for exactly the ordinary human needs that do not pause simply because a person happens to be royal. This was managed with the same careful discretion applied to every other intimate aspect of her nightly routine, attended to quietly by trusted women, emptied and cleaned by servants working further down the household hierarchy, the whole arrangement handled with a practiced, unremarkable efficiency that turned what might otherwise feel awkward into simply one more small, well-managed detail among the many others filling this carefully attended night. There is an old idea from this exact period of English political thought, and it fits so precisely into everything we have been exploring tonight that it feels worth sharing even at this quiet, drowsy hour. Legal and political theorists of the Tudor era developed a concept known as the king's two bodies, the notion that a monarch existed simultaneously as two distinct entities occupying a single physical form. There was the body natural, the ordinary, mortal physical person, subject to illness and age, and every ordinary human limitation, the same body we have spent tonight watching undressed, washed, tucked beneath warm blankets, kept awake sometimes by toothache or worry exactly like anyone else. And there was the body politic, an eternal symbolic entity representing the crown itself, the continuous unbroken institution of monarchy that persisted regardless of which particular mortal person happened to occupy the throne at any given moment, a body that, in the language of the theorists who developed this idea, never died and never truly slept at all. Elizabeth herself, in various speeches and writings across her reign, invoked versions of this idea explicitly, most famously in a speech to Parliament, where she described having, in her own words, the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. Whatever we make of that particular framing today, and there is a great deal that could be said about the gender politics embedded within it, it captures something genuinely useful for understanding everything we have spent tonight exploring. The elaborate architecture of guards and locked doors and constantly attending women existed, in a very real sense, to protect two different things simultaneously: the mortal, physical, tired body of an actual woman who needed rest just like anyone else, and the eternal symbolic body of the English crown itself, which could never be permitted to appear vulnerable, could never be allowed to actually rest unguarded, because an unguarded body politic represented, to the political imagination of the age, something close to an unguarded kingdom. This helps explain, I think, why even the most private, most physically intimate hours of Elizabeth's night remained so thoroughly attended, so carefully secured. It was never really only about protecting one tired woman from harm, though that mattered too, genuinely and personally, to the women who cared for her. It was about the way this particular tired woman also carried, inseparably bound up within her single physical form, the continuous symbolic weight of an entire nation's stability. Her body natural might have longed, on certain nights, for the simple, unwatched privacy any ordinary person takes for granted. Her body politic could never actually be granted that privacy, not once, not for a single night across 45 years, because the body politic, by the very theory that structured how her entire era understood monarchy, was never supposed to be alone at all. I find something genuinely poignant in that framework, honestly, the way it takes what might otherwise read simply as excessive royal paranoia and reframes it as something closer to an unresolvable structural tension, built directly into the philosophical understanding of what a monarch actually was. Elizabeth did not choose this particular tension. She inherited it, along with the crown itself, and she spent 45 years of nights, this one among countless others we have not specifically named, living inside a contradiction that the political theory of her own age had already anticipated and, in its own abstract way, already tried to explain. On some nights, weather itself became the dominant presence in the room, and it is worth imagining one of those nights specifically, because English weather has never been shy about announcing itself. A real autumn storm, the kind that rolls in off the Atlantic and batters the eastern edge of England with genuine force. Rain driving hard against leaded glass windows that, however well crafted, could never fully silence a storm determined to be heard. Wind finding every small gap in old stonework and turning it into a low, mournful note that rose and fell for hours without any real pattern to it. On a night like this, even the fire's usual steady presence took on a different character, flames occasionally guttering sideways when a particularly strong gust found its way down the chimney, sending a brief acrid puff of smoke curling back into the room before the draught settled again. A storm like this would have made the whole palace feel smaller and more enclosed than usual. its vast rooms and long corridors somehow drawing inward around the simple primal comfort of being warm and dry while something wild moved through the darkness outside. The women attending Elizabeth on a night like this might find themselves speaking a little more quietly than usual, not from any particular fear, but simply responding to the same instinct that makes any of us lower our voices when weather turns dramatic outside a window, a kind of unconscious deference to something larger and considerably more indifferent than ourselves. Elizabeth herself, whatever private concerns of state might otherwise have kept her mind occupied, may have found a storm like this oddly soothing rather than disturbing, the sheer overwhelming presence of it drowning out smaller, more persistent worries the way white noise sometimes does for a restless mind today. There is a particular kind of sleep that comes easier during weather like this, I think, something almost everyone has experienced in one form or another. The way rain against a window can feel less like an intrusion and more like permission, a natural signal that the world outside has settled into its own version of rest, and that staying inside, warm and sheltered, requires no further justification or effort. If Elizabeth slept well on nights like this, and there is no particular reason to assume she did not, it would fit a pattern reported across nearly every era and culture, the strange comfort humans consistently find in being safely, dryly present for weather they do not have to actually endure directly. Let the rain in your own imagination now. Whether or not there is any actual weather happening near you tonight, do some of that same quiet work. Let it be simply present, a sound moving steadily through the room around this particular sleeping queen, 400 years gone now, and yet, in this specific imagined moment, still entirely, peacefully alive within the story we are telling together. Now let us widen our view for a moment, away from this one particular chamber, and consider what the rest of the palace looked like during these same deep night hours, because Elizabeth's sleep existed within a much larger sleeping, and not entirely sleeping world. A royal household of this scale employed, depending on the specific palace and season, several hundred people in various capacities, and while the great majority of them had long since retired for the night by the hour we are describing, certain corners of the palace never fully went dark or fully went quiet. The kitchens, tucked away in their own separate wing, often set some distance from the main residential rooms, both for practical reasons of smoke and heat management, and to reduce the risk of fire spreading to more valuable parts of the building. Maintained banked fires through the night, coals kept gently smouldering, rather than allowed to die completely, ready to be built back up quickly in the pre-dawn hours, when the enormous task of feeding a royal household for another full day would need to begin all over again. A skeleton staff moved through these lower service areas even at the deepest hour of the night, a baker perhaps checking on dough left to prove slowly overnight, ready for the earliest batch of bread that would need to emerge from the ovens well before most of the household stirred. The particular yeasty warm smell of that overnight proving would have drifted faintly through certain corridors by the very early morning hours, an entirely unglamorous, thoroughly practical smell that nonetheless represented its own small, comforting signal that the machinery of the household continued turning, steadily, reliably, even while its most important resident slept undisturbed several rooms and several floors away. Stables, too, maintained their own separate nighttime rhythm, grooms sleeping in quarters near the horses themselves, alert to the particular sounds that might indicate a horse in distress, a door left carelessly unlatched, any small disturbance requiring immediate attention. The Queen's own horses, along with the considerable number maintained for messengers, guards and visiting courtiers, represented a genuine investment requiring round-the-clock care regardless of the hour, and the rhythm of that care, hay being replenished, water checked, the low murmur of grooms speaking quietly to settle a restless animal, continued its own steady pattern entirely separate from whatever unfolded within the Queen's own private rooms. Somewhere in the palace, too, a night watchman or two made their own slow, deliberate rounds through corridors and courtyards, checking that doors remained properly secured, that no candle had been left carelessly burning near flammable hangings, that the general order of the household remained intact through hours when most eyes were closed and most attention naturally relaxed. This was its own quiet profession, this walking of a sleeping building, and the men who performed it developed, over years of service, an intimate physical knowledge of the palace's every creak and shadow, able to distinguish instantly between the ordinary settling sounds of an old building and anything that might actually warrant closer attention. All of this, the banked kitchen fires, the watchful grooms, the patient night watchman making his rounds, existed as a kind of extended circulatory system supporting the smaller, more intimate world of the Queen's own bedchamber, largely invisible to her in any direct sense, and yet entirely necessary to the particular quality of safety and continuity that allowed her, on most nights, to eventually find some measure of actual rest. It is worth remembering, I think, how many hands, entirely unseen and unthanked in any individual sense, kept turning through every single hour of every single night across her 45-year reign, so that one woman in one warm curtained bed might occasionally manage to simply sleep. The night moves on, the way it always does, indifferent to how much or how little rest has actually been found within it, and somewhere past 4 in the morning, the very first faint suggestions of change begin to arrive, though nothing dramatic yet, nothing a person could point to with real certainty. Perhaps the quality of darkness beyond the curtains shifts almost imperceptibly, the absolute black of deep night softening by some fraction toward the deep blue-grey that precedes actual dawn by a considerable margin still. Birds, if the season is right for it, may begin their first tentative calls well before any real light exists to justify them. A single voice starting somewhere in the palace gardens, answered gradually by others, building slowly into the fuller chorus that will eventually announce the day properly. Inside the chamber, the woman sleeping on the truckle bed nearby stirs slightly. Some deep internal clock, honed by years of exactly this same schedule, beginning to nudge her toward wakefulness even before any external signal has actually arrived. This is its own quiet skill, developed across a working lifetime in royal service, an almost physical attunement to the rhythm of a household that must be ready, fully ready, well before its most important member actually requires attention. She does not leap up immediately. There is still time yet, still a stretch of genuine quiet remaining before the actual business of the morning must begin in earnest. But some part of her has already, without quite deciding to, begun the mental preparation for what is coming. The fire, if it has not already been quietly tended once or twice through the deepest part of the night by whichever servant held that particular overnight responsibility, will need attention again soon, banked embers coaxed back toward genuine flame well before the room's other occupants actually wake, so that the Queen, when she does finally stir, wakes into a room that has already begun warming rather than one still holding the full chill of the coldest pre-dawn hour. This small, unglamorous task, performed quietly and without fanfare by someone whose name will likely never appear in any surviving record of this particular morning, represents exactly the kind of invisible labour that made every other more visible ritual of Elizabeth's day actually possible. And here, in this quiet stretch before actual waking, let us simply stay a while longer, because there is nothing that needs to happen quickly here. The room holds its low golden light from the freshly tended fire. The woman on the truckle bed has settled back, for now, into a lighter doze rather than full wakefulness. Beyond the curtains, whatever sleep Elizabeth herself has managed to find continues undisturbed a little longer, this last small pocket of the night before the day's enormous machinery of ceremony and duty and careful public performance begins, once again, to assemble itself around her. When Elizabeth does finally wake, whether gradually on her own or gently roused by an attendant at whatever hour her schedule for that particular day required, the entire elaborate process we watched unfold in reverse the night before begins again, this time moving forward, building the public Queen back up layer by careful layer from the private woman who has spent these last several hours simply, quietly resting. It is worth walking through this morning transformation properly, because it mirrors so precisely everything we witnessed at the start of tonight's story, and there is something genuinely satisfying, I think, in watching a ritual complete its full circle. The curtains are drawn back first, carefully, allowing the room's low morning light, whatever the season currently provides, to mix with the fire's steadier warmth. A basin of warm water, already prepared by servants who anticipated exactly this moment, is brought for washing, face and hands cleaned of whatever residue the night has left behind. a simple, unhurried beginning before anything more elaborate gets underway. This quiet washing represents, in its own small way, the last few minutes of the day that belong to her alone, before the machinery of royal presentation begins its steady work. Next comes the cosmetic mask, applied with the same careful, practiced hands that removed it the night before. White paint worked smoothly across skin that spent the night finally free of it, a process that, by every account, took real time and real skill to execute properly, an attendant's steady hand building up the careful uniform pallor that would define Elizabeth's public face for the rest of that day. Alongside this, colour was added too, a touch of red at the lips, sometimes at the cheeks, achieved through various period preparations that, like the white paint itself, we would recognise today as containing ingredients no modern cosmetic would ever include, a reminder of how differently that era understood the relationship between beauty and what we would now consider basic bodily safety. The wig follows, lifted from its careful overnight storage and settled back into place, pinned securely by hands that have performed this exact task thousands of times before, restoring in a matter of minutes the familiar reddish-gold silhouette that court and country alike had come to recognise as belonging unmistakably to their queen. Underneath, her own thinning hair disappears once more from view, tucked away beneath the wig's careful construction, returning to that state of near-total public invisibility that had defined it for years by this point in her reign. Then comes the clothing itself, and this is where the mourning ritual truly demonstrates its full complexity, because dressing a body in Elizabethan formal wear required considerably more coordinated effort than undressing one ever had the night before. The farthingale first, that wide structural understructure lifted into place and secured at the waist, immediately re-establishing the distinctive silhouette that would define every other layer built upon it. Then the bodice, boned and rigid, laced carefully up the back, or sometimes the front depending on the specific garment's construction, an attendant's careful hands working through each point in sequence, pulling gently but firmly enough to achieve the smooth, structured line that Elizabethan fashion demanded, while never so tight as to cause genuine discomfort across what might be many consecutive hours of wear. Sleeves are attached next, pinned or laced into place at the shoulder, chosen specifically for that day's planned activities and the particular political or ceremonial weight those activities carried. A day involving foreign ambassadors might call for sleeves considerably more elaborate, more visibly expensive, than an ordinary day devoted primarily to routine council business, clothing functioning throughout Elizabeth's reign as a genuine, carefully calibrated tool of diplomatic and political communication, every choice weighted with meaning that a modern viewer might easily miss entirely. The ruff, that distinctive circular collar so strongly associated with the entire Elizabethan era, required its own considerable expertise to construct properly each morning. Starched linen worked into precise, even folds using heated setting sticks, a skill that took genuine years to master, and that only a small number of specially trained attendants within the royal household would have been trusted to perform for the Queen herself. A poorly set ruff, uneven or limp, would have been visible to every single person Elizabeth encountered that day, a small but genuinely consequential failure that no attendant responsible for it would have wanted to explain. Finally, the jewels return, each piece retrieved from its secure overnight storage, checked against the careful records kept the previous evening, and fastened into place according to that day's particular requirements, more restrained for routine business, considerably more elaborate for any occasion involving foreign visitors or important ceremony. By the time this entire process concludes, often taking a full hour or more from start to finish, the transformation is complete. The tired, aging, entirely human woman who settled into bed the night before has been rebuilt, piece by careful piece, into the queen the kingdom expected to see, ready now to step back out through that same door we watched her walk through at the very start of tonight's story, back into the vast, watching, endlessly demanding public world that awaited her every single morning of her 45-year reign. There is another name worth including here before we move toward the close of tonight's story, because she represents, in many ways, an even longer thread of continuity through Elizabeth's private world than even Cat Ashley managed to provide. Blanche Parry served Elizabeth from her infancy, decades before any of us, or Elizabeth herself, could have known she would one day rule, and remained in her service for the better part of 6 decades all told, eventually rising to the position responsible for overseeing the Queen's jewels and, by extension, holding a level of trusted daily access to Elizabeth's most private world that very few people, male or female, noble or otherwise, ever came close to matching across the entire span of the reign. Blanche Parry never married, dedicating what amounted to essentially her entire adult life to royal service, and she remained active in her role well into genuine old age, her eyesight famously failing considerably in her final years while she nonetheless continued, by every account, to hold her position and Elizabeth's evident trust and affection almost until her own death in 1590. Picture for a moment what that particular relationship must have actually felt like from the inside. 2 women who had quite literally grown old together across an almost unimaginable span of shared daily life. One of them the most powerful woman in Europe, the other entrusted, night after night for 60 years, with jewels worth a genuine fortune, and with a level of physical intimacy and practical knowledge of the Queen's private habits that no foreign ambassador, no council member, no visiting dignitary could ever hope to access. When Blanche Parry finally died, Elizabeth is recorded as having arranged for her burial with real personal attention to the details involved, a commission for an elaborate monument that survives today, its inscription composed, according to some accounts, with input from the Queen herself, an old woman's genuine grief for another old woman who had spent essentially her entire life quietly, faithfully present at the edges of every single one of Elizabeth's most private hours. There is something worth sitting with in that particular loss, coming as it did roughly 25 years into Elizabeth's reign, the Queen by this point deep into middle age herself, watching the slow, inevitable departure of the very women who had helped build and maintain the private world we have spent so much of tonight exploring. This is, I think, one of the genuinely underappreciated dimensions of a reign this long. 45 years is an extraordinary span of time, long enough that an attendant who began serving a young, uncertain new queen in her 20s might by the reign's end be attending an elderly monarch nearing 70, the relationship itself aging and deepening across decades in a way that few working relationships in any era, royal or otherwise, ever managed to sustain. The particular women who moved through Elizabeth's private chambers changed gradually across those decades, some retiring, some dying, new faces gradually taking on the same careful, practiced duties, and yet the fundamental shape of the ritual itself, undressing, prayer, careful guarding through the night, morning transformation, remained remarkably constant throughout, a stable architecture of private life persisting steadily beneath the constantly shifting cast of individual people who maintained it. It is worth pausing here to consider, briefly, how Elizabeth's particular nightly arrangement compared with what other powerful women of her era experienced, because the contrast tells us something useful about just how much of this world was shaped by choice as much as by circumstance. Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin and, for many years, her most dangerous domestic rival, spent nearly 2 decades held in various forms of custody within England, moved periodically between different noble households under guard, her own nights governed by an entirely different logic of confinement rather than sovereign command. Where Elizabeth's guards existed to protect her, Mary's existed, in large part, to contain her, and the psychological weight of that distinction, protection versus imprisonment, however similar the outward architecture of locked doors and watchful attendants might have appeared from a distance, must have shaped the actual lived experience of each woman's nights in profoundly different ways. Across the English Channel, Catherine de' Medici, the formidable Queen Mother who effectively governed France through the reigns of 3 of her own sons during roughly this same period, maintained her own version of a heavily attended, carefully guarded private life, though shaped by the particular customs and dangers of the French court rather than the English one. Catherine, unlike Elizabeth, had been married, had borne numerous children, and her nights across earlier decades would have included a royal husband sharing at least some portion of that intimate space before widowhood eventually reshaped her own domestic arrangements into something considerably closer to the pattern we have spent tonight exploring in Elizabeth's own life. two of the most powerful women in 16th century Europe, ruling kingdoms locked in constant, complicated rivalry with one another, and yet sharing this same basic underlying reality that genuine physical privacy simply did not exist as an option available to women who held this particular kind of power, regardless of which specific kingdom or court happened to surround them. I find this comparison useful precisely because it helps clarify what was actually unique about Elizabeth's situation, and what was simply the shared condition of powerful women across this entire era of European history. The absence of a husband in her bed was distinctly her own choice, and a genuinely radical one by the standards of her time, a decision that shaped English succession politics for the entire remainder of her reign. But the presence of attendants, the guards, the careful watching through the night, none of that was unique to her at all. It was simply what power looked like, for a woman, in this particular corner of history, regardless of whether that power was exercised as an unmarried queen regnant in England, or a widowed queen mother manoeuvring through the treacherous factional politics of the French court. Privacy, real solitary privacy, belonged almost entirely to people without power to protect, which is its own quiet, complicated irony worth sitting with as we drift now toward the close of tonight's particular story. Let us think for a moment about the sheer accumulated weight of repetition sitting behind everything we have described tonight, because I think it is easy, hearing all this in a single continuous story, to lose track of just how many times each individual piece of this ritual actually happened across the whole span of Elizabeth's reign. 45 years. If we simply multiply that out across the roughly 365 nights contained within each of those years, we arrive at a number somewhere well beyond 16,000 individual nights, each one involving some version of the undressing, the careful accounting of jewels, the removal of the cosmetic mask, the prayers, the guards taking their positions, the fire tended through the darkness, and the whole elaborate process reversed again each following morning. 16,000 nights is a genuinely difficult number to hold in the mind all at once, and yet that is roughly the scale of what we have actually been describing tonight, condensed down into the shape of one single representative evening. Consider what that kind of repetition does to a person, to a household, to the small handful of relationships sustained across so many thousands of shared private hours. Ritual, performed with this kind of relentless consistency across decades, stops functioning simply as a sequence of practical tasks and becomes something closer to identity itself, a structure so deeply embedded in daily experience that its absence would likely have felt far stranger than its endless familiar presence ever did. Elizabeth at 25, newly crowned, still learning the exact shape and rhythm of these nightly rituals, was in some sense a genuinely different person from Elizabeth at 65, for whom this same sequence of undressing and guarding and morning reconstruction had become so deeply automatic that she likely could not have easily described its individual steps if asked, the way none of us can easily narrate our own most ingrained daily habits without pausing first to consciously reconstruct them. And yet something did remain constant across that entire span, something worth naming clearly before we finally let this particular night draw to its close. The fundamental human need underneath all of this elaborate ceremony, the need for warmth, for safety, for the particular comfort of trusted company nearby through the vulnerable hours of darkness, never actually changed at all across those 45 years, even as the specific women providing that comfort came and went, even as Elizabeth's own body aged, and her political circumstances shifted dramatically from the uncertain early years of her reign through its long, stable middle decades and into the more anxious, uncertain final years, shadowed by questions of succession and mortality. The architecture around that need grew more elaborate, more heavily guarded, more thoroughly ritualized with each passing year of accumulated danger and precedent. But the need itself, at its most basic level, remained exactly what it has always been for every human being who has ever needed to close their eyes and trust, at least for a few hours, that they would be safe doing so. There were certain nights, rare enough to stand out clearly against the general pattern of ordinary repetition we have just described, when the household's careful nighttime calm was genuinely disrupted, and it is worth pausing on one such occasion because it illustrates just how quickly this whole elaborate architecture of calm, guarded privacy could be overturned when real danger actually announced itself. In 1586, investigators uncovered what became known as the Babington Plot, a conspiracy involving a group of English Catholics planning Elizabeth's assassination in coordination with a planned invasion intended to place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the English throne in her place. The discovery of this plot, arriving through the patient, methodical intelligence work of Elizabeth's principal secretary and spymaster, triggered a period of genuine heightened alarm throughout the entire royal household. Security measures intensified considerably beyond even their already substantial ordinary baseline. Picture what a night during this particular period of crisis might actually have involved, compared with the calmer, more routine evening we spent most of tonight's story exploring. Additional guards, without question, posted not just along the usual corridors, but at points that ordinary security had not previously considered necessary. Greater scrutiny applied to absolutely everyone granted access to the Privy Chamber, even individuals who had served faithfully for years, suddenly finding their movements watched with a fresh, careful attention that would have felt, to anyone genuinely loyal, both entirely understandable and quietly uncomfortable all at once. Messengers arriving at unusual hours, carrying updates on the ongoing investigation, would have interrupted the evening's normal quiet rhythm with real frequency during the most intense weeks of this particular crisis. Urgent conversation conducted in low, careful voices just beyond the chamber door, close enough that fragments might have reached Elizabeth herself even through walls and heavy curtains designed to keep the night's ordinary business from disturbing her rest. It is genuinely difficult to imagine that sleep came easily during nights like these, whatever the practiced calm of the surrounding ritual managed to project outwardly. And yet, by every indication the surviving record provides, Elizabeth herself maintained a remarkable outward composure throughout even the most alarming crises of her reign, a discipline that colleagues and courtiers alike frequently remarked upon with something close to genuine astonishment. Whatever the private cost of that composure, and there surely was some genuine private cost, paid out quietly across sleepless hours we have no direct record of, the public performance of calm authority rarely wavered in any way visible to those around her. This particular plot concluded, eventually, with Mary's own execution the following year, a resolution carrying enormous weight and consequence that we will not dwell on further tonight, beyond simply noting that the danger, this time, resolved itself in Elizabeth's favour, and the household's elevated alertness gradually, over the following weeks and months, settled back down into its more familiar, sustainable rhythm. Let us return, one final time, to pure sensation, because that is really where this story belongs most comfortably, and where I want to leave you for a good long while, before we finally close things out completely. Imagine the specific, layered quiet of a palace held along the Thames on an ordinary clear night. Nothing dramatic unfolding, no crisis demanding anyone's urgent attention, simply an evening allowed to be exactly what it is. Somewhere beyond the walls, the river itself moves steadily past in the dark, its particular sound, water against stone, against the hulls of moored boats, against the wooden pilings of a nearby jetty, a low, constant, essentially wordless murmur that would have been simply part of the background texture of life at Greenwich or Whitehall for anyone who lived there long enough to stop consciously noticing it. An owl calls somewhere out in the palace grounds, that particular soft, hollow sound carrying easily through still night air, answered eventually perhaps by a second owl further off, an entirely ordinary exchange between two birds going about their own nocturnal business, with no awareness whatsoever of the extraordinary human history unfolding within the walls nearby. Crickets, if the season allows it, add their own steady rhythmic texture beneath everything else, a sound so consistent and so gentle that it functions almost like silence itself, present without demanding any real attention. Inside, the room holds its low, familiar warmth. The fire has settled into its final overnight rhythm, occasional soft collapses of ash and ember requiring no real intervention now, simply the natural, unhurried progression of a fire slowly consuming itself down toward morning. The candle, if one remains lit at all by this hour, has burned low enough that its flame has taken on that particular small, steady quality flames developed just before they finally gutter out entirely, no longer flickering with the restless energy of a fresh candle, but settled, patient, quietly persistent. And somewhere within all of this accumulated soft sound and low warm light, a woman sleeps, or rests as close to sleep as this particular night has allowed her, carrying within her single physical body both the ordinary human vulnerability we have spent tonight exploring so carefully and the vast symbolic weight of an entire kingdom's continuity and stability. Both of those things are true simultaneously every single night for the entire span of her reign, and there is no real way to fully separate them from one another, no version of Elizabeth Tudor that exists as purely one or the other. She is every single night we have described tonight, and every night we have not specifically named, both things at once, an ordinary tired woman and an extraordinary enduring symbol, resting together within the same single body, attended by the same small circle of trusted women, guarded by the same watchful men in the corridor beyond, through the same long accumulated span of 16,000 individual nights that, taken together, add up to one of the longest and most consequential reigns in the whole of English history. When Elizabeth finally died at Richmond in March of 1603, the throne passed to James, the son of her old rival Mary, Queen of Scots, and it is genuinely striking, briefly, just how differently the new king's own private nightly world would come to operate compared to everything we have spent tonight exploring. James brought with him a court culture shaped by very different personal habits, openly favouring a series of close male companions across his reign, in a manner that historians have discussed at considerable length, and his own bedchamber arrangements reflected priorities and relationships quite distinct from the carefully guarded, almost entirely female world that had surrounded Elizabeth for 45 unbroken years. This shift matters here, not because we need to dwell on the details of a different reign entirely, but because the contrast helps sharpen exactly what made Elizabeth's own nightly world so particular. Her insistence on an unmarried, husbandless bed was never simply a personal romantic preference, however much popular history has sometimes chosen to frame it that way. It was a deliberate, carefully maintained political position, sustained consistently across 4.5 decades, despite enormous, persistent pressure from councillors, from Parliament, from foreign suitors and their governments, all of whom wanted very badly for her to marry and secure the succession through an heir of her own body, that she never did, that the great curtained bed we have spent tonight exploring remained, in that specific and politically loaded sense, permanently her own, represents one of the genuinely singular achievements of her reign, a queen who managed to hold that particular boundary firm against pressure that would have overwhelmed almost anyone else in her position. And yet, as we have traced so carefully across everything else tonight, that singular boundary existed alongside a complete absence of the ordinary privacy most of us take entirely for granted in our own nightly lives. She won the argument about the husband. She never won, and likely never even seriously attempted to win, any argument about simply being alone. Perhaps, in the end, those two things could not actually be separated from one another at all. Perhaps the very same political and practical realities that made an unmarried, husbandless throne survivable for 45 years also required, as their necessary and inseparable cost, this constant careful attendance, this endless guarding, this fundamental impossibility of true solitude that we have spent this entire evening's story exploring together, one careful layer at a time. Let us think for a while about how this entire pattern shifted with the turning of the seasons across a single year, because we have mentioned this in passing already tonight, but it deserves a fuller telling. Winter at Whitehall meant a bedchamber transformed by necessity into something close to a fortress against genuine cold. Additional fur-lined coverlets brought out from storage, heavier curtains hung around the bed, sometimes an additional smaller brazier of coals, positioned within the room itself to supplement the main hearth's warmth during the very coldest stretches of January and February. The women attending Elizabeth during these months dressed themselves in heavier layers too, their own comfort a quieter, less documented concern, but a real one nonetheless, since a genuinely cold attendant serves considerably less effectively than a comfortable one, whatever the difference in rank between queen and lady in waiting. Summer brought its own entirely different set of adjustments. Lighter linens replaced the heavier winter bedding. the fire reduced to a small evening blaze rather than the substantial, carefully maintained burn required through winter's longest, coldest nights. Windows, where security considerations allowed it, might be opened slightly to admit whatever cooling breeze the evening offered, a small compromise between comfort and the ever-present caution that shaped nearly every decision made within these rooms. The elaborate wig, too, became a genuine burden during the hottest weeks of an English summer, and there is some suggestion in surviving accounts that Elizabeth, in the true privacy of these late evening hours before sleep, welcomed its removal with particular relief during the warmest stretches of the year, the simple physical comfort of a bare, cool head after hours spent beneath heavy, elaborately dressed hair. Between these two extremes, the milder months of spring and autumn brought their own particular textures. A fire needed some evenings and not others. Bedding adjusted gradually rather than switched wholesale between one extreme and the other, the whole household's rhythm shifting in small, almost imperceptible increments as the year turned steadily from one season into the next. Anyone who has lived through enough English seasons understands this particular gradual quality of change, the way autumn arrives not as a single dramatic shift, but as a slow accumulation of slightly cooler evenings, slightly earlier darkness, until one day the fire that felt optional a few weeks earlier has become entirely necessary again, and nobody could quite tell you the exact evening when that transition actually occurred. This seasonal rhythm, repeated across 45 consecutive years, gave Elizabeth's nights a kind of underlying calendar entirely separate from the political and ceremonial calendar that structured her public days. Parliament might open or close according to the demands of state business, ambassadors might arrive or depart according to the shifting currents of European diplomacy, but the fire's size, the weight of the bedding, the particular quality of darkness beyond the window, these things followed their own older, steadier rhythm, indifferent to whatever crisis or celebration happened to be occupying the Queen's daylight hours that particular week. There is something quietly reassuring in that indifference, I think. The way the natural turning of seasons continued its own patient work, regardless of everything else happening around it, offering perhaps its own small, wordless kind of comfort to a woman whose days were rarely permitted any comparable simplicity. There is a particular kind of trust required to live the way Elizabeth lived, and I want to sit with that idea properly before we finally let this story rest. Every single person granted access to her private chambers, every guard posted along the corridor, every woman permitted to lace her gown or brush out her hair, represented, at least in theory, a potential danger as much as a source of comfort and protection. This was not paranoid thinking on the court's part. It reflected genuine, well-founded historical experience. Assassination attempts against monarchs across this exact period sometimes came from within a ruler's own trusted household, rather than from some clearly identifiable external enemy, and Elizabeth's own advisors would have been acutely, professionally aware of this uncomfortable reality throughout her entire reign. And yet the alternative to trust, genuine isolation, complete solitude, was simply never available to her at all, not as any kind of realistic option. A queen cannot dress herself in the elaborate layered clothing we described earlier tonight without assistance. She cannot easily verify her own safety within a palace this size without others watching on her behalf. The practical requirements of her position made some minimum baseline of trust absolutely unavoidable, regardless of the genuine risk that trust necessarily carried with it. What Elizabeth and her closest advisors developed, across decades of careful practice, was less a solution to this fundamental tension than a sophisticated, continuously refined system for managing it as safely as any system reasonably could. Layers of vetting and background, and years of demonstrated loyalty required before anyone was permitted into the innermost circles of her private world. The same small trusted names, Ashley, Parry, and others we have not had time to name individually tonight, appearing again and again across decades of surviving household records, precisely because that hard-won trust, once genuinely established, was treated as something far too valuable to casually risk or replace. It is worth remembering, too, that these women had their own lives beyond this careful, constant service, families and personal concerns that existed alongside their royal duties, even if the demands of that duty left them relatively little time to attend to those other threads of their own existence. A lady of the bedchamber might receive news of her own family's troubles, a sick child, a husband's business difficulties, a parent's failing health, and still be required to appear the following evening, composed and attentive, ready to perform the same careful, practiced rituals of undressing and settling the queen for the night, her own private worries folded away somewhere behind an expression of calm professional attention that the position simply demanded, regardless of whatever else might be genuinely occupying her heart and mind that particular week. There is a quiet, largely unrecorded cost embedded in that arrangement too, carried by women whose own names survive, when they survive at all, mostly as footnotes within a much larger and more famous story that was never really at its centre about them. If you were to visit England today and walk through the surviving rooms of Hampton Court Palace, now maintained as a historic site open to any visitor willing to buy a ticket, you would pass through spaces that once formed part of exactly this world we have spent tonight exploring, though considerably altered across the intervening centuries, redecorated and modified by successive monarchs long after Elizabeth's own reign concluded. The specific chamber where she actually slept on any particular night does not survive intact in the way a visitor might hope, the palace having been substantially rebuilt and reconfigured multiple times since her death, most dramatically under later monarchs who favoured more modern architectural fashions over the surviving Tudor and early Elizabethan structures. And yet something of the scale, the sheer physical grandeur of ceiling heights and window proportions, remains genuinely present in the surviving Tudor sections of the palace, enough that a careful visitor can still, with some real effort of imagination, begin to picture the kind of world we have spent this whole evening carefully reconstructing. Greenwich Palace itself did not survive at all in its original Tudor form. The buildings Elizabeth actually knew largely demolished and replaced over the following centuries, first by later Stuart building projects and eventually by what became the Old Royal Naval College, an entirely different kind of grand architecture, occupying roughly the same riverside ground where Elizabeth was born, and where she spent so many of the specific nights we have described tonight. There is something worth noting in that particular loss, I think, the way even the most physically substantial monuments of any given era eventually give way, in one form or another, to whatever the following centuries decide to build in their place. The palace is gone. The particular bed, the particular curtains, the particular candles that burned low on any specific night we have described tonight, none of it survives in any physical sense a visitor could actually touch or see today. And yet the story survives anyway, carried forward through the careful surviving records, the household accounts and diplomatic dispatches and personal letters that historians have spent generations patiently reconstructing into something close to the detailed picture we have been exploring together tonight. This is, in its own way, its own small quiet miracle, the way a woman's most private, most carefully guarded hours she surely never expected to be discussed in this kind of detail by strangers living 4 centuries into an unimaginable future, nonetheless left behind enough of a trace that we can sit together tonight, in whatever room you happen to be resting in right now, and reconstruct something genuinely close to what those hours actually contained. History, at its best, does exactly this kind of quiet, patient work, reaching backward across centuries to recover not just the grand public events that dominate most textbooks, but the smaller, more intimate textures of how people actually lived, hour by hour, through lives that otherwise might have simply vanished, unremembered, into the general accumulated silence of the past. Let us think too about the particular sound of a page turning, because it is exactly the kind of small detail worth including in a story built for exactly this hour of your own night. When Elizabeth read in these late hours, whether classical literature or state papers requiring her attention, the paper itself would have carried a different quality entirely from what we associate with a printed book today. Fine handmade paper, sometimes vellum for the most important or ceremonial documents, produced a distinct sound when turned, a soft, substantial rustle quite unlike the thin, quick sound of modern mass-produced paper. Ink, too, took genuine time to dry fully, meaning any writing done at this late hour required a certain unhurried patience. The pen lifted and held steady for a moment before the page could be safely turned or folded. a small enforced pause built directly into the physical mechanics of written communication in this era, a pause that a modern typist, tapping out thoughts at whatever speed their fingers allow, has entirely lost. There is something worth noticing in that particular difference, I think, the way this era's basic physical tools imposed their own natural rhythm of patience onto even the smallest daily tasks. A letter could not simply be dashed off and sent in seconds the way a message might travel today. It required paper prepared in advance, ink mixed and available, a quill properly trimmed, and afterward time allowed for the ink to properly set before the letter could be folded, sealed with warm wax pressed by a signet ring, and finally handed to whichever messenger would carry it onward. Even Elizabeth's most urgent late-night correspondence moved through this same unhurried physical process, urgency expressed through the content and tone of what was written rather than through any possibility of truly instantaneous transmission. This particular quality of enforced patience touched almost every aspect of the world we have spent tonight exploring. Nothing happened quickly in any absolute sense, not the elaborate dressing and undressing, not the careful preparation of correspondence, not even the simple daily task of building up a proper fire, which required kindling gathered and arranged with real attention rather than the instant flame available at the flick of a modern switch. And yet within that slower physical world, an entire, genuinely urgent political and diplomatic reality still moved forward, decisions still made, crises still managed, an entire kingdom still governed, all of it conducted at a pace that would strike most of us today as almost impossibly unhurried, and yet clearly sufficient, across 45 years, to sustain one of history's genuinely consequential reigns. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes specifically from being watched, and I think it is worth naming clearly here, because it threads through nearly everything we have discussed tonight without always being stated outright. Being observed, even by people who mean you nothing but genuine care and loyalty, requires a small ongoing expenditure of attention that a person left truly alone simply does not have to spend. A slight adjustment of posture, a controlled expression, the constant low background awareness that one's face, one's voice, one's smallest gesture might be noticed and, in some sense, interpreted. All of this accumulates across a day, and Elizabeth's days, unlike almost anyone else's in the entire kingdom, extended this particular demand into her very last waking hours before sleep, and resumed it again the instant she woke each morning. Modern research into human behaviour has given us language for exactly this phenomenon that Elizabeth's own era lacked entirely, the simple, well-documented fact that people behave differently, hold themselves differently, even think somewhat differently when they know they are being observed compared to genuine private solitude. We call this today, among other things, the observer effect, and while the term itself would have meant nothing to anyone in Elizabeth's household, the underlying reality it describes would have been intimately, exhaustingly familiar to her, experienced continuously across essentially every waking, and as we have spent tonight exploring, every sleeping hour of her entire adult life. Consider then just how remarkable those small pockets of genuine private interiority we identified earlier tonight actually were. The quiet moments of prayer, the reading pursued for her own pleasure and no other reason, the particular pieces of music she chose to play simply because she enjoyed them. These were not large spaces of privacy by any ordinary measure. They existed within rooms still occupied by other people, still subject to at least some degree of that same low background observation we have just described. And yet within that observed space, Elizabeth apparently managed to carve out something that functioned, for her, as genuine private experience, a mind engaged with ideas and sounds and words chosen entirely for herself, unwatched in the ways that actually mattered most to her, even while remaining visible in every physical sense to the women sharing the room around her. I think there is something genuinely instructive in that particular skill, whether or not Elizabeth herself would have described it in quite these terms. The capacity to locate genuine private experience within circumstances that offer no possibility of true physical solitude is not a uniquely royal skill, though her particular circumstances demanded it with unusual intensity and consistency. It is something many people across many different circumstances have needed to develop in their own lives, in crowded homes, in shared spaces, in situations where true alone time simply is not available in the quantity a person might genuinely want. Elizabeth's particular version of this skill, refined across 45 years of practice, night after night, offers its own quiet kind of instruction, even across the considerable distance of 4 intervening centuries. There is a particular annual custom worth including here, because it touches directly on the jewels we have discussed at various points tonight, and it offers a pleasant, gentler note before we move toward our final closing. Each new year, Elizabeth's court observed an elaborate tradition of gift-giving, courtiers and officials across the entire kingdom presenting the Queen with carefully chosen presents, very often jewellery, embroidered clothing, or other fine objects, in a custom that functions simultaneously as genuine seasonal celebration and as an important, closely observed measure of political standing. Detailed rolls survive from various years of her reign, careful lists recording exactly who gave what, a fascinating surviving record that historians have used to trace shifting patterns of favour and influence across the court. The relative value and thoughtfulness of a particular gift often read, by contemporary observers, as a fairly reliable indicator of a courtier's current standing in royal esteem. Many of these gifts, particularly the finer jewellery, would eventually make their way into the very jewel collection we discussed earlier tonight, catalogued and stored by the same careful officers responsible for the Queen's nightly wardrobe, some pieces eventually worn during the elaborate evening rituals we spent so much of tonight's story exploring. A single ring or brooch carrying within it an entire small history of political calculation and personal ambition on the part of whichever courtier originally selected and presented it. Picture, for a moment, one particular piece of jewellery removed during an ordinary evening's undressing, carefully logged by the attending officer, and consider that this same small object might have arrived at court years earlier as a carefully considered New Year's gift from some nobleman, hoping to secure the Queen's favour, its later, quieter role in an ordinary bedtime ritual representing simply the final, unremarkable chapter in what had originally been a genuinely significant political gesture. This is, I think, one of the quieter pleasures of studying this particular era in this kind of close, patient detail. The way even the smallest objects carried multiple layers of meaning simultaneously, political and personal, public and private, all folded together within a single physical thing small enough to be lifted, at the end of an ordinary evening, by a lady of the bedchamber's careful hands and set gently aside for the night. The world we have spent tonight exploring was, in this specific sense, remarkably dense with meaning, almost nothing purely simple or purely functional, every object and every gesture carrying some additional weight of significance that a modern observer has to work carefully to properly recover and understand. Let us think once more about her voice, because it is, in the end, one of the genuinely remarkable things history has actually preserved for us across this considerable distance of time. Elizabeth was, by nearly universal contemporary agreement, an extraordinary public speaker, and several of her most famous speeches survive today in forms close enough to their original delivery that we can still, even now, hear something of her actual rhetorical style, the particular rhythm and confidence of her public voice. Her address to the troops gathered at Tilbury in 1588, delivered during the height of the Armada crisis we discussed earlier tonight, remains one of the most quoted pieces of English royal oratory in the entire historical record, a speech in which she famously described having the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, words we touched on briefly earlier when discussing the theory of the king's two bodies. It is worth holding that public voice alongside everything we have explored tonight about her private hours, because the contrast tells us something genuinely important. The commanding, confident figure who addressed her assembled troops with such evident authority was the very same woman whose wig came off each evening to reveal ordinary thinning grey hair, whose cosmetic mask required careful daily reconstruction, whose sleep, in her later years particularly, was troubled by insomnia and toothache and the ordinary accumulated weight of age. Both versions of Elizabeth were entirely genuine. Neither one was somehow more real or more true than the other. The commanding public queen and the tired private woman existed simultaneously within a single person, each one dependent on the other in ways that a purely public or purely private telling of her story would inevitably miss. Near the very end of her reign, in a speech to Parliament sometimes remembered today as her Golden Speech, delivered in November of 1601, an aging Elizabeth reflected with evident genuine emotion on the nature of her long rule, describing the deep, sincere love she believed existed between herself and her subjects, a bond she clearly valued as among the most meaningful achievements of her entire reign. Whatever the political calculation woven into any royal speech, and there was surely some calculation present even here, the emotional weight of those words, delivered by a woman by then well into her 60s, nearing the true close of an extraordinary life, carries a genuine, moving sincerity that historians across the following centuries have consistently noted and returned to. I mention this here, at this particular late hour of our own story tonight, because it feels like the right note to be sitting with as we finally begin to draw everything together. The public Elizabeth and the private Elizabeth were never truly separate people, however useful that distinction has been for organising the story we have told tonight. They were always the same woman, moving continuously between one register and the other, sometimes within the space of a single hour, the commanding voice at Tilbury and the tired woman requiring assistance with her wig existing within the very same body, carrying, always, the very same accumulated weight of decades spent in service to a kingdom that, by nearly every measure available to us, she genuinely, deeply cared about. Let us settle now, fully, into the final stretch of this particular night, because we have covered a great deal of ground together, and I think it is time to simply rest within it, rather than continue adding new detail. Picture the room one final time, exactly as it has existed throughout tonight's story, the fire low and steady, the curtains drawn close around the great bed, the faint familiar sounds of a palace settled into its own deep overnight rhythm, continuing gently beyond these walls. Somewhere within that warm enclosed darkness, Elizabeth Tudor sleeps, or drifts somewhere close to sleep, carrying within her, as she carried every single night across 45 years, both the ordinary human tiredness we all recognise so easily in ourselves, and the vast, singular weight of a crown that never truly came off, not even here, not even now. Consider, one final time, everything that made this particular kind of rest possible for her. Layer upon careful layer of it. Women who had known her since childhood, standing quiet watch nearby. Guards positioned along corridors she rarely thought to notice anymore after so many years of their constant presence. A whole invisible household of bakers and grooms and night watchmen, continuing their own steady work through hours she would never personally witness. And beneath all of it, an entire careful political and philosophical architecture built specifically to explain why a queen's body, natural and politic both at once, could never simply be left alone the way an ordinary person's body might reasonably expect to be. And consider too everything that remained, despite all of that, genuinely hers alone, the particular books she chose to read purely for her own pleasure, the specific pieces of music that brought her some measure of private comfort at the close of a long day, the prayers she composed in her own words, in languages she had mastered through her own considerable intellectual discipline, addressed to a God she approached, by every surviving account, with genuine and sustained sincerity across the whole span of her long life. These smaller, quieter possessions of the mind and heart existed alongside the crown, protected by nothing more than her own inner life, requiring no guards, no locked doors, no careful accounting by trusted officers, entirely, permanently, unshakably her own in a way that nothing else available to her, not even her own bed, not even her own face beneath its careful nightly mask, could ever quite manage to be. I want you to think for just a moment about what it might mean to carry both of those things at once, the way Elizabeth did across her whole long reign. The outer life, watched, attended, structured by duty and danger and the accumulated expectations of everyone around you, and the inner life, quieter, smaller, entirely your own, existing in the particular books you choose, the particular music that settles something in your chest, the particular private words you might offer, some nights, to whatever you understand rest and safety to actually mean. Most of us will never carry anything close to the outer weight Elizabeth carried. Most of us will never need guards posted outside our own bedroom door, we'll never have our own sleep quality discussed in the diplomatic correspondence of foreign governments, we'll never need to reconstruct an entire public face each morning from a private one that rested, briefly, unwatched, the night before. And yet I think there is something genuinely worth taking from her particular story anyway, something that translates gently across the considerable distance separating her world from whatever room you happen to be resting in tonight. The recognition that privacy and solitude, real and valuable as they are, were never actually the thing that made her night survivable across 4.5 decades of relentless, exhausting responsibility. What made them survivable was something else entirely: trusted company nearby, familiar rituals repeated with enough consistency that the body could relax into them without conscious effort, small pockets of genuine private pleasure carved out even within circumstances that offered no possibility of complete solitude. If you find yourself tonight without the particular kind of quiet, uninterrupted privacy you might sometimes wish for, know that history's most carefully guarded queen never once had it either, and she found her own way toward rest regardless, night after night, for 45 years. Let the fire in this room we have built together tonight burn down now, all the way, gently, the way fires do when nobody needs to tend them any further. Let the guards outside settle into the particular stillness of the deepest, quietest part of the night, their watch continuing, but requiring nothing further from us to imagine or describe. Let the women sleeping nearby, Cat Ashley in the earlier years of this story, Blanche Parry across so many decades of faithful service, and all the others whose names the surviving record has kept or lost across 4 centuries of time, rest now too, their long day's careful work finally, genuinely complete until morning asks the same of them all over again. And let Elizabeth herself in this final quiet stretch of tonight's story simply be a woman asleep in a warm bed. Nothing more urgently required of her right now than exactly that, the crown set carefully aside until morning, the mask removed and not yet needing to be reapplied, the elaborate architecture of monarchy holding steady around her without requiring her own conscious attention for these few remaining hours of genuine deserved rest. Whatever burdens tomorrow will inevitably bring back to her, and there would always, across her whole reign, be some burden waiting with the dawn. Tonight, this particular night we have spent together, asks nothing further of her at all. Let us step back once more, briefly, before we let this particular night finish settling into its final stillness, because there is one more thread worth following, and it concerns the physicians who attended Elizabeth throughout her reign, men whose own private observations of her health and habits offer some of the most genuinely intimate surviving glimpses into exactly the private world we have spent tonight exploring. Royal physicians of this period kept careful records, noting appetite, sleep, general vigor, the small daily fluctuations of health that in an ordinary household would have concerned only immediate family, but which for a reigning monarch carried genuine political weight extending far beyond the walls of any single bedchamber. These men occupied a curious position within the household hierarchy, granted a particular kind of intimate access, permission to ask questions and make observations that even senior courtiers would never have dared raise directly, and yet remaining for all that intimacy fundamentally outside the small trusted circle of women who actually performed the daily physical work of Elizabeth's care. A physician might be summoned to examine her, might offer counsel on diet or rest or the various herbal remedies we discussed earlier tonight, and then would withdraw again, leaving the actual continuous work of attendance to the women who remained behind, night after night, in a way no physician's occasional visits ever quite matched. Their surviving notes and correspondence, fragmentary as much of it is after 4 intervening centuries, nonetheless paint a picture of a woman whose health, taken as a whole across her long reign, was genuinely robust for most of her life, a fact her own physicians and contemporary observers frequently remarked upon with something close to real admiration, particularly given the considerable stress and responsibility she carried continuously. It was really only in the final years, the last decade or so of her reign, that the record shows a more sustained pattern of physical decline, the kind of gradual accumulated wear that comes, eventually, to nearly everyone who lives long enough to experience genuine old age, royal or otherwise. I find something quietly reassuring in that particular fact, actually, The way even a life this extraordinary, this thoroughly documented and scrutinized, still followed essentially the same basic biological arc that governs every human life regardless of rank or circumstance. Vigorous youth and middle age, followed eventually by the slower, more careful rhythms of genuine old age, sleep growing more difficult, small physical complaints accumulating with greater frequency, the body simply requiring, as bodies eventually do, more patience and more careful tending than it once demanded. Elizabeth's particular version of this universal human arc happened to unfold within a palace, attended by physicians whose notes survive in royal archives rather than family letters, but the underlying pattern itself, the plain fact of aging, belonged to her in exactly the same unremarkable way it belongs to every one of us. Each November, as her reign progressed, the court celebrated what became known as Accession Day, marking the anniversary of Elizabeth's coronation with elaborate public tournaments, tilts staged by knights competing in her honour before enormous crowds of spectators, a tradition that grew steadily more elaborate and more central to the public celebration of her reign as the decades passed. These events represented, in their own way, the furthest possible extreme from the quiet private world we have spent tonight exploring. Enormous public spectacle deliberately designed to project strength, permanence, and continued vitality to a watching kingdom that needed, particularly as Elizabeth aged, continued visible reassurance that their queen remained genuinely capable of ruling. The gap between these two versions of her, the woman requiring careful assistance with a wig each evening, and the carefully maintained public image of enduring youthful vigour celebrated at these annual tournaments, grew more pronounced as her reign continued into its final decades. Portraits commissioned during her 60s frequently continued to depict a considerably younger-seeming face, part of a deliberate, carefully managed campaign to control her public image that art historians have studied extensively, official portraiture increasingly diverging from whatever the physical reality of an aging queen actually looked like by that point in her life. This was not simple vanity, though vanity surely played some genuine part in it. It reflected a real, calculated political understanding that an aging, visibly fragile monarch, in an era still deeply anxious about succession and continuity, risked a genuine erosion of authority that a carefully maintained image of enduring strength could help forestall. And so the private nightly rituals we have spent this entire evening exploring, the mask applied and removed, the wig fitted each morning with such careful practiced skill, existed in direct service to exactly this larger political project, the sustained, decades-long maintenance of an image that grew, with each passing year, somewhat further removed from the private physical reality unfolding each night within these carefully guarded chambers. There is something worth sitting with in that particular gap, I think, the sheer scale of collective effort required to sustain it, dozens of trusted hands working together, evening after evening, morning after morning, to keep that gap invisible to everyone beyond this small circle of women who alone actually knew both versions of her intimately. Beyond the court itself, meanwhile, the broader era that carries Elizabeth's own name today was producing some of the most enduring cultural achievements in the whole of English history, a flourishing of theatre and poetry and exploration that historians and casual observers alike have long recognised as genuinely remarkable, the work of Shakespeare and Marlowe filling London's public theatres, English ships venturing further across the world's oceans than ever before, a genuine, sustained cultural confidence that would go on to shape English identity for centuries afterward. Elizabeth herself, tired and ageing within the private world we have spent tonight exploring, presided, whether she fully grasped its ultimate significance or not, over one of the genuinely great creative flowerings in the whole of European history, her own carefully guarded private nights unfolding in quiet, largely unremarked parallel alongside a public cultural explosion that would eventually come to bear her very name. In her final weeks at Richmond, during the early months of 1603, the pattern we have spent this whole night carefully reconstructing continued, even as Elizabeth's health declined in ways her attendants could no longer simply manage through the accumulated small comforts and careful routines that had sustained her across so many previous difficult stretches. The same women who had served her for years remained close throughout these final weeks, the fundamental shape of nightly care unchanged even as its underlying purpose shifted gradually from sustaining an active reigning queen towards something gentler, something closer to simple comfort, offered to a woman nearing the genuine end of an extraordinarily long life. Contemporary accounts describe her spending considerable time in these final weeks, seated rather than lying down, reportedly refusing at times to be persuaded into bed, a detail that some historians have connected to the same restless, difficult relationship with sleep that troubled her increasingly across her later years, and others have read simply as the particular restlessness that sometimes accompanies genuine physical decline near the very end of life. Whatever the precise explanation, her attendants remained close throughout, offering the same patient, practiced care they had offered across so many thousands of previous nights, adapting now to circumstances considerably more difficult than anything the ordinary rhythm of her reign had previously required of them. She died in the early hours of the morning on the 24th of March, surrounded, by every account, by exactly the kind of familiar, trusted attendants that had characterized her entire private life across 45 years of reign. Robert Cecil, her chief secretary by this point in her life, and several of her closest remaining ladies were present, the final moments of an extraordinary reign unfolding within essentially the same kind of carefully attended, thoroughly witnessed private space that had defined every other night we have spent tonight exploring. Even in this final, most private of all possible moments, Elizabeth Tudor was not alone, and there is something I think genuinely fitting in that particular continuity, the pattern of her entire adult life holding steady right through to its very end. I do not want us to linger too long here, because this particular story tonight was never really meant to be about her death. However naturally our own story has eventually arrived at mentioning it, it was meant to be about her nights, the ordinary, endlessly repeated architecture of care and caution and quiet private pleasure that filled so many thousands of evenings across her extraordinary life. Her death, when it finally came, simply represents the closing of that same long pattern, one final version of the careful attendance that had defined literally every other night of her reign, the same fundamental shape holding true right to the very end. Let us return one final time to where we began tonight, that quiet corridor, that door opening into a room already occupied by waiting women, that first small revelation that the most powerful woman in Europe walked toward her rest each night into company rather than solitude. We have spent this entire evening exploring exactly what filled the hours that followed that particular walk, across not just one representative night, but, in some sense, across the full accumulated weight of 45 years of remarkably similar evenings, each one built from the same careful, practiced components, undressing and prayer and careful guarding through the darkness, morning transformation and the return, each day, to a public world that demanded everything the private hours had allowed her to briefly set down. Think of everyone we have met along the way tonight. Kat Ashley, who had known her since childhood and grieved was returned in full when she finally passed. Blanche Parry, keeper of the royal jewels across nearly 6 decades of faithful, quiet service. The yeomen of the guard standing their careful watches through countless identical nights, their names almost entirely lost to history despite their essential daily role in keeping this whole world safe. The bakers and grooms and night watchmen whose invisible labour kept the palace's larger circulatory system functioning through every single hour of every single night, whether the Queen herself ever knew their names or not, and Elizabeth herself at the centre of all of it, carrying simultaneously the ordinary human need for rest that every one of us shares, and the extraordinary symbolic weight of a crown that never truly fully came off, not even here, not even in her own most private hours. If there is a single thread worth carrying with you from everything we have explored together tonight, I think it is this. Power and privacy are not, as they might first appear, simply two versions of the same reward, more of one automatically producing more of the other. Elizabeth possessed more power than almost any woman in the whole of European history up to that point, and she possessed, correspondingly, almost no genuine physical solitude at all, not for a single night across her entire 45-year reign. These two things existed in something closer to direct tension than easy alignment, And understanding that tension, I think, helps make sense of so much of what we have spent tonight carefully exploring together. The guards and the locked doors, the constant careful attendance, the small precious pockets of genuine private interiority she managed, against real odds, to carve out for herself anyway. You, resting now in whatever room actually surrounds you tonight, in all likelihood possess something Elizabeth Tudor never once had the luxury of experiencing across her entire adult reigning life: genuine, uncomplicated solitude, a door that closes and actually means something when it does, a bed that belongs entirely and simply to you without guards or attendants, or careful officers cataloguing what surrounds it. That particular ordinary freedom, so easy to take for granted, so rarely even consciously noticed, was simply never available to her. Not once, not for a single night in 45 years. Let that thought settle gently now, not as a burden, but as a small, quiet form of appreciation for whatever genuine privacy your own life actually contains, however modest, however ordinary it might otherwise seem. There is one more small pocket of this world worth visiting before we finally let the night close completely, and it concerns something we have touched on only briefly so far: the particular relationship Elizabeth maintained with her own reflection. Mirrors in this period were considerably smaller and less common than we might assume today. Precious objects made from polished metal or, increasingly by the later decades of the 16th century, from genuine glass backed with a thin reflective coating, expensive enough that even a wealthy household might possess only a handful of them, carefully positioned and carefully guarded against the very real risk of breakage. A queen's private chambers would, without much doubt, have included at least one fine mirror, likely more, used during both the elaborate morning construction of her public face and the quieter evening ritual of its removal. Picture her for a moment, seated before one of these mirrors during the final stage of her evening preparation, watching in that slightly imperfect, softly distorted reflection as the last traces of the day's careful cosmetic work were gently wiped away, the white paint lifting gradually to reveal, beneath it, whatever her own actual aging face happened to look like on that particular evening. This must have been, in its own quiet way, one of the more genuinely private moments available to her within an otherwise thoroughly attended day, not because the room itself was empty, it never was, but because the specific act of watching her own private face slowly re-emerge from beneath its public covering belonged to her in a way that even the most attentive lady of the bedchamber could only ever witness from the outside, never fully share. Historians studying royal portraiture and the broader culture of image-making during Elizabeth's reign have noted how carefully controlled access to her actual, unmediated appearance became as her reign progressed. Official portraits requiring approval, unauthorized or unflattering depictions actively discouraged or suppressed where possible. In this context, the mirror held a peculiar significance, one of the very few places where the real, current, aging face could exist without any of that careful curation or control, a genuinely honest reflection in a court otherwise built almost entirely around the careful management of appearance and perception. There is something worth noting in that, I think, the way even something as ordinary as a mirror carried, within this particular carefully constructed world, its own small measure of significance far beyond its simple practical function. Let us also spend a moment considering the particular texture of silence itself within these rooms, because silence, properly understood, was never actually silent at all in any absolute sense. Even in the deepest, quietest hour of the night, a careful listener would have registered dozens of small sounds moving through the space around her, breathing from the nearby truckle bed, the occasional soft settling of the feather bed itself as a sleeping body shifted position, fabric against fabric as heavy curtains stirred faintly in whatever slight draught the old stone building never quite managed to eliminate entirely. This is, I think, worth remembering whenever we use the word silence too casually. The way genuine restful quiet rarely means true absence of sound, but rather a particular gentle texture of familiar, unthreatening sound, low enough and steady enough that the mind simply stops registering it as anything requiring attention. There is a particular kind of correspondence worth mentioning before we finally let this night settle completely, and it concerns the letters Elizabeth exchanged, across many years, with other rulers she never once met in person. Ivan IV of Russia, known to later history by a far harsher title, maintained an unlikely correspondence with Elizabeth across a good portion of her reign, exchanging letters that touched on trade, diplomacy, and according to some surviving accounts, occasional proposals of marriage that Elizabeth handled with her usual careful, non-committal diplomatic skill. These letters, composed and received sometimes during exactly the kind of late evening hours we have spent tonight exploring, connect her private nightly world to a genuinely vast international web of correspondence stretching from Moscow to Constantinople to the courts of Spain and France, a queen managing, through nothing more than careful handwriting and patient waiting for distant replies, a genuinely global network of relationships that shaped the fate of nations she would never personally visit. Picture, for a moment, a letter from some distant court arriving at an unusual hour, carried by a messenger who had travelled considerable distance and endured genuine hardship simply to place a single sealed document into the proper hands. Elizabeth's own responses to such correspondence, drafted sometimes with the assistance of her secretaries, and sometimes, for matters she considered particularly delicate, in her own hand entirely, represent some of the most historically valuable surviving evidence of her actual private thinking, unfiltered by the more careful, performative language often required for public speeches or formal court occasions. A private letter to a foreign ruler, composed late in the evening after the day's more public business had concluded, sometimes reveals a sharper, more direct version of her thinking than anything she would have permitted herself to say aloud within the more carefully observed setting of her own court. This particular kind of late evening correspondence work connects directly to something we discussed earlier tonight. The way Elizabeth's mind seemed genuinely resistant to fully switching off even during hours nominally reserved for rest and private reflection. A queen managing relationships with rulers as varied as the Tsar of Russia, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, with whom she also maintained active diplomatic correspondence, seeking trade advantages against her Spanish rivals, and the various Protestant princes of the German states whose support mattered considerably to England's broader religious and political position in Europe, carried within her own private evening hours a genuinely staggering breadth of ongoing international concern, each relationship requiring its own careful, considered attention, each letter representing hours of careful thought condensed into a document that might travel for weeks before reaching its intended recipient. And yet, remarkably, this same woman still found room within those same crowded, demanding hours for the smaller private pleasures we have spent so much of tonight exploring. The music, the classical reading pursued for its own reward, the particular scent of lavender tucked among her linens. There is something genuinely admirable in that particular capacity, I think. The ability to hold both the vast, genuinely consequential weight of international diplomacy and the small, quiet, entirely personal comforts of an ordinary evening within the very same limited handful of private hours available to her each night. Most of us, faced with even a fraction of the responsibility she carried, would likely find those smaller personal comforts crowded out entirely. That she apparently managed to preserve room for both across so many thousands of nights tells us something genuinely important about the particular discipline and inner resilience that carried her through such an extraordinarily long and demanding reign. Let us think too about the particular quality of trust required to fall asleep at all under these circumstances, because it is worth naming directly rather than simply implying. Genuine sleep, the deep restorative kind rather than merely lying still with closed eyes, requires the nervous system to lower its guard in ways that a person who feels genuinely unsafe simply cannot manage, regardless of how tired they might otherwise be. This is well understood by anyone who has ever tried and failed to fall asleep in an unfamiliar place, a hotel room in an unfamiliar city, the first night in a new home before it has come to feel properly safe and familiar. The body's own ancient alarm systems, evolved across a vastly longer span of time than any royal court or guarded palace has ever existed, remain quietly active until enough evidence has accumulated that the immediate environment poses no genuine threat. For Elizabeth to have slept at all across so many thousands of nights, despite genuine and well-documented threats against her life, required that her own nervous system had somehow learned to trust the particular architecture of safety constructed around her, the guards, the locked doors, the trusted women nearby, deeply enough that actual rest became possible rather than merely a hopeful pretense of it. This is, in its own way, a genuine testament to just how effectively that whole elaborate system of protection actually functioned across her reign, not merely as political theatre or ceremonial display, but as something that operated deeply enough, consistently enough, to allow a targeted, endangered monarch to actually achieve real physical rest most nights, despite carrying, simultaneously, a level of genuine danger that would have left many people permanently and severely sleepless. I think this detail deserves real appreciation, actually, the sheer practical achievement represented by all of it, the guards and the trusted attendants and the carefully checked doors, working together across decades to produce not merely the appearance of safety, but something functioning closely enough to genuine safety that actual sleep, actual rest, actual recovery from each demanding day's accumulated exhaustion remained possible for her, most nights, across the whole extraordinary length of her reign. That achievement belonged to no single person. It belonged to the whole careful, patient, largely unnamed collective effort of everyone we have discussed tonight, and to many others besides whose names never made it into any surviving record at all, working together, night after night, for 45 years, simply to make one woman's rest genuinely possible. Before we finally let everything settle, let us take one last unhurried walk through the physical texture of this world, gathering together, gently, all the small sensory threads we have touched throughout tonight's story into one final, complete picture. The particular warm, slightly waxen smell of beeswax candles burning low, the dry, faintly smoky scent of a well-tended oak fire, distinct from the sharper smell of pine, or the heavier smell of coal that filled so many lesser households of the period. Lavender and rosemary tucked among fine linen, their fragrance released gently whenever fabric shifted or settled, the particular soft rustle of heavy silk or velvet, distinct from the crisper sound of linen, distinct again from the low creak of old oak flooring underfoot. Consider the textures too, the smooth coolness of pearls against skin before they warmed slightly from contact, the rougher, more substantial weight of gold and gemstones in comparison, the soft give of a feather bed compared to the firmer resistance of the woolen mattress layered beneath it, the particular crisp coolness of fresh linen sheets against skin, still slightly warm from the day's activity, gradually softening into the gentler, more familiar warmth that comes from a body actually settling into rest. Every single one of these small physical details, gathered together across a single evening, formed the actual lived texture of what we have spent this whole night trying to properly understand and describe. And consider, finally, the sounds, threaded throughout everything we have discussed tonight, the soft scrape of a chair, the low murmur of women's voices kept deliberately quiet out of simple habitual courtesy, the distant muffled footsteps of a guard completing his slow round, the settling creak of old timber cooling after a day of use, the occasional soft collapse of ash within the dying fire, and beneath all of it, always, the particular quality of near silence that settles over any large old building once its most active hours have finally passed. Not true silence, never quite that, but something close enough to it that a tired mind can finally, gratefully let go. This is the world Elizabeth Tudor actually inhabited each night across her extraordinary 45-year reign, not the flat, simplified version so often presented in popular retellings, grand and glamorous and somehow effortless, but this fuller, richer, considerably more complicated reality, extraordinary luxury existing alongside genuine physical discomfort, immense power existing alongside almost total absence of ordinary privacy, a woman simultaneously among the most watched and most guarded people in the whole of Europe, and, in her own carefully carved-out pockets of private reading and prayer and quiet music, genuinely, meaningfully alone in exactly the ways that mattered most to her own inner life. We have spent a long while together tonight reconstructing this particular world, piece by careful piece, and I hope something of its particular texture, its warmth and its watchfulness, both at once, has settled comfortably around you by now, however different your own circumstances happen to be from a 16th century queen's carefully guarded bedchamber. The fundamental human experience underneath all of it, the simple universal need to feel safe enough, warm enough, cared for enough to finally close one's eyes and rest, belongs equally to her and to you, separated by 4 centuries of considerable historical distance, and yet connected, still, by something as old and as simple as the particular relief of a tired body finally, gratefully, allowed to stop. There is one final comparison worth making before we let this particular night finish closing around us, and it concerns the very different experience of an ordinary Tudor household's own nighttime world, because holding these 2 pictures side by side helps clarify just how genuinely unusual Elizabeth's particular circumstances actually were. An ordinary prosperous family of the period, a merchant household perhaps, or a modest country gentry family, might share a single bedchamber among the entire immediate family, parents and younger children together, older children and any servants sleeping elsewhere in the house according to whatever space happened to be available. Privacy, in the modern sense we casually assume today, one person, one room, a closed door genuinely meaning solitude, simply did not exist as a widespread expectation anywhere in this society, royal or otherwise. In that light, Elizabeth's situation was, in one sense, simply an intensified, more elaborately guarded version of something nearly universal across her entire era. Shared sleeping space, limited genuine solitude, a household's collective safety and comfort, prioritized over any individual's private space. What made her circumstances genuinely exceptional was not the basic absence of privacy itself, which nearly everyone in this period experienced in some form, but rather the sheer scale and formality of the arrangement, the dozens of specifically titled attendants, the armed guards, the careful bureaucratic tracking of jewels and keys and access, all of it constructed specifically around the unique demands of protecting a targeted, endangered head of state, rather than simply reflecting the ordinary practical space constraints that shaped how most families of the period slept. This distinction matters, I think, because it helps prevent us from either overstating or understating just how unusual her particular nightly world actually was. She was not uniquely deprived of some universal human right to solitude that everyone else around her freely enjoyed. Genuine solitary sleeping space was, in fact, a considerable luxury throughout this entire society, available in any meaningful sense mainly to the very wealthy, and even then frequently set aside in favour of shared arrangements considered safer or more practical. What set Elizabeth apart was the specific, deliberate, heavily guarded nature of her particular shared arrangement, built not from ordinary domestic necessity, but from the genuine, sustained political danger that shadowed her entire reign, a qualitatively different kind of constant company than an ordinary Tudor family experienced, even if the basic absence of true solitary privacy connected her, in some general sense, to nearly everyone else living through this same historical period. And there is something worth appreciating, I think, in recognizing that connection clearly, rather than imagining Elizabeth's world as some entirely alien, unrelatable royal exception to how ordinary human beings actually lived. The particular quality of trust required to sleep soundly with other people nearby, the particular comfort of familiar voices and familiar routines easing the transition into rest, the particular vulnerability inherent in the act of sleep itself, requiring us all, regardless of rank or circumstance, to set down our guard and trust whatever arrangement surrounds us. All of this connected Elizabeth directly to the vast majority of people living through her own era, and in its own way connects her forward across 4 centuries to you as well, however different the specific architecture of your own nightly safety and comfort happens to look tonight. Sleep itself, when you really sit with it properly, has always required this same fundamental act of trust, whether extended toward a locked bedroom door in a quiet modern house, toward a partner sleeping beside you, toward the general accumulated safety of a familiar neighborhood, or, as in Elizabeth's own particular case, toward an elaborate architecture of guards and trusted attendants and carefully checked locks, refined across decades of genuine practiced necessity. We have spent this whole evening exploring one especially elaborate, especially well-documented version of that universal human requirement, and I hope, by now, something of its particular careful construction, warmth built alongside watchfulness, comfort built alongside genuine caution, has helped illuminate something true about your own experience of rest as well, however different the specific details of your own night happen to be from the one we have spent so long, so carefully reconstructing together. One last small image before we finally let everything rest completely. Somewhere in the palace archive, if such a thing had survived intact across the intervening centuries, there would exist a ledger kept faithfully by whichever officer of the wardrobe held that particular responsibility during any given year, recording in careful, unremarkable handwriting the small daily details of exactly what we have spent tonight exploring, gowns removed and stored, jewels accounted for and returned each morning, candles purchased and consumed, linens sent for laundering and fresh ones brought in their place. Most of these particular ledgers have not survived, lost to fire or simple decay, or the ordinary indifference of centuries toward paperwork nobody thought especially important to preserve. But enough related records do survive, scattered across various archives and collections, that historians have managed to reconstruct, with real confidence, the broad outline of exactly the world we have spent this whole evening carefully walking through together. There is something quietly moving in that fact, I think, the way an entire private world, guarded so carefully in its own time, protected by locked doors and watchful guards and careful discretion, has nonetheless left behind enough of a trace in ledgers and letters and the careful observations of ambassadors and physicians that 4 centuries later we can still, with real patience and real care, reconstruct something genuinely close to what those private hours actually contained. Elizabeth herself surely never imagined her nightly rituals would someday become the subject of careful historical study, still less the subject of a story told specifically to help someone she could never have imagined existing 400 years in an unknowable future ease gently toward their own night's rest. And yet here we are, and here you are, having spent this whole evening together in her company, in a manner of speaking, walking alongside her through the careful undressing and the quiet prayers and the long-guarded darkness and the eventual, inevitable morning transformation back into her public self. If nothing else survives of everything we have discussed tonight beyond this simple fact, let it be this. She was, across all of it, the guards and the jewels and the mask and the crown, simply a person, tired sometimes, comforted sometimes, carrying weight most of us will never have to carry, and finding, within that weight, whatever small pockets of genuine peace she reasonably could. That is, in the end, not so very different from what any of us are doing, each night, in whatever room happens to hold us. Think too about the particular discipline required to maintain this same careful rhythm night after night, year after year, decade after decade, without ever once allowing it to grow careless or complacent, because that particular kind of sustained discipline is itself a genuinely remarkable achievement, easy to overlook amid the more dramatic elements of the story we have told tonight. Guards did not simply grow bored and inattentive after years of uneventful watches. Attendants did not simply grow sloppy in their careful handling of jewels and gowns after decades of routine repetition. The entire elaborate system held its careful shape across the whole span of Elizabeth's reign, precisely because everyone involved understood, at some deep and constantly reinforced level, exactly what genuine failure might eventually cost. This kind of sustained institutional discipline, maintained across so many thousands of individual nights by so many different people across so many years of service, represents its own quiet form of collective achievement, rarely celebrated in the way grander political or military accomplishments tend to be remembered, and yet arguably just as essential to the overall success and longevity of Elizabeth's remarkable reign. A queen who could trust night after night that her particular careful architecture of safety and comfort would hold firm, was a queen genuinely freed, at least during these private hours, to actually rest rather than remain in a state of constant, exhausting personal vigilance. That freedom, purchased through decades of careful, largely unheralded institutional discipline, made possible everything else we have discussed tonight. The prayers, the reading, the small private pleasures carved out within an otherwise thoroughly attended existence. And so, as we finally let this particular night draw to its close, let us hold that thought gently alongside everything else, the way genuine safety, properly built and properly maintained across years of patient, careful effort, becomes its own quiet gift, not loud, not dramatic, simply present, night after night, reliable enough that a tired mind can finally, gratefully stop checking and simply rest. Whatever combination of people and habits and familiar routines provides that particular gift in your own life tonight, know that it represents its own genuine, valuable achievement, however ordinary it might feel from the inside, however little conscious thought you generally give it. Elizabeth Tudor understood, across 45 years of careful, hard-won experience, exactly how much that particular gift was actually worth. Consider, finally, one small practical detail we have not yet mentioned tonight, the particular care taken with the very air of the room itself. Palace apartments of this scale and importance were sometimes fitted with small perforated containers, sweet bags or pomanders, filled with dried herbs and spices, cloves and orris root among them, hung discreetly or placed within chests and cupboards to keep both linens and the air itself pleasantly scented. A small additional layer of comfort added atop everything else we have already described, one more quiet piece of evidence for just how thoroughly every single sensory detail of this world had been considered and deliberately shaped. Even the air Elizabeth breathed as she finally settled towards sleep carried, in its own subtle way, the same careful attention lavished on every other aspect of her private hours. And with that final small detail settled gently into place alongside everything else we have gathered tonight, let us finally allow the whole careful, elaborate world we have spent this evening reconstructing to simply rest. The candles are out. The fire holds its last quiet warmth beneath a bed of soft grey ash. The guards continue their familiar, unhurried rounds, needing nothing further from us to imagine. And somewhere within all of that accumulated warmth and watchfulness, a tired woman, Queen of England for 45 remarkable years, finally, gratefully, sleeps. Before we let the fire finish settling, there is one more quiet stretch worth spending time in, and it concerns the particular skill required of the women who managed all of this, not just the practical tasks themselves, but the pacing of them. A gown removed too quickly could tear delicate fabric. A wig lifted carelessly could shift the small pins holding it in place and leave a mark. Records and household manuals from the period suggest that training for these roles took real time, months if not years, before a new attendant could be trusted with the Queen's own person, rather than simply the surrounding tasks of the chamber. This was not work anyone stepped into casually, whatever ease the finished routine appeared to have from the outside. There is also the matter of what these women actually talked about, or did not, while their hands moved through this practiced sequence. Surviving letters and the occasional diary entry from women who served in similar households elsewhere suggest that these hours could hold genuine conversation, questions about family, small pieces of court gossip exchanged quietly, or simply comfortable silence between people who had done this together for years. We do not have a transcript of any specific evening. What we have instead is a reasonable picture, built from scattered fragments, of what this kind of shared repetitive intimacy tends to produce between people, something closer to old friendship than to formal service, even within a relationship still structured, always by rank. Consider, too, how differently this same evening might have unfolded, depending on the year. Early in her reign, a younger queen, still establishing the shape of her own authority, may have approached these hours with a different kind of attention than the older, more settled monarch of later decades, for whom the whole sequence had likely become close to automatic. We cannot know the exact texture of any particular night with certainty. What we can reasonably say is that this rhythm, undressing, careful accounting of jewels and cosmetics, prayer, guarded rest, repeated across so many years, gradually became something closer to structure itself than to a series of individual choices made fresh each evening. Let us also spend a moment on how much of this particular picture rests on inference rather than a single unbroken first-hand account. No diary survives in which one of Elizabeth's ladies described, evening by evening, exactly what happened behind these doors. What survives instead is a patchwork, household expense records noting candles and linens purchased, wardrobe accounts tracking gowns and jewels, the occasional ambassador's letter mentioning the Queen's health or mood, physician's notes, and the broader customs recorded in household manuals written for noble families more generally during this period. Historians have pieced together the likely shape of an ordinary evening from these fragments, reasonably, carefully, but a reasonable reconstruction is still a reconstruction, and it is worth holding what we have described tonight a little loosely rather than as a fixed transcript of any one specific night. Think for a moment about how strange it would feel to have your own private evening reconstructed this way by strangers centuries from now, working only from scattered receipts and second-hand mentions, and you begin to appreciate just how much careful, patient guesswork sits quietly underneath even the most confident-sounding historical narration, this one very much included. It simply means that when we describe 4 women in the room, or a particular sequence of gown before jewels before cosmetics, we are describing what the evidence makes plausible and consistent with how households of this rank generally operated, rather than a moment anyone actually wrote down in full. Elizabeth's own private hours were, by design, among the least documented parts of an otherwise extensively recorded life, which is itself telling. The parts of her existence she and her household worked hardest to keep private are exactly the parts that left the thinnest paper trail behind them, and that thinness is itself a kind of evidence, a quiet confirmation of just how carefully guarded these particular hours actually were, even from the historical record that has otherwise preserved so much of the rest of her long, thoroughly documented life. None of this makes the picture any less worth sitting with tonight. It simply means holding it, gently, as the careful reconstruction it genuinely is, rather than as a complete transcript no single evening ever actually left behind. There is a broader point worth making here too, since it applies to nearly everything we have covered tonight, and everything still ahead of us. History of this kind, the intimate, domestic, behind closed doors kind, almost always involves this same balance between solid documentary ground and careful, informed reconstruction. We know with real confidence that Elizabeth used cosmetics containing white lead, that she wore wigs in her later years, that guards and locked doors structured access to her private rooms, that she never married and therefore never shared her bed with a husband. These are well supported by the surviving record. The precise number of women present on any single evening, the exact order in which garments came off, the specific tone of conversation in the room, these details are plausible extrapolations rather than verified facts, offered tonight as a reasonable way of imagining a world that otherwise risks staying abstract and difficult to picture. Consider, before we move on, that this same basic uncertainty about lived detail versus surviving record applies to nearly every historical figure we might ever choose to spend an evening with, kings and queens included. The past rarely hands us a complete transcript of anything. It hands us fragments, and the patient, careful work of history lies in fitting those fragments together honestly, without pretending more certainty exists than actually does. A queen's evening, reconstructed honestly, with its genuine uncertainties left visible rather than smoothed over, feels more real, not less, than a version presented with false precision it cannot actually support. The gaps in the record are, in their own way, part of the story too, a reminder that even the most extensively documented monarch in English history kept some rooms of her life quiet enough that 4 centuries of careful historical work still cannot fully see inside them. Think for a moment about your own evening tonight, and how little of it would actually survive into any historical record at all, even an unusually well-documented one. The specific order you moved through your own bedtime routine, the particular thing you thought about while brushing your teeth, whatever small comfort you reached for on your way towards sleep. None of it typically gets written down anywhere, and yet all of it is real and specific and entirely yours while it is happening. Elizabeth's evenings were no different in that basic sense, full of small, specific, unrecorded moments that existed fully in their own time, and then simply passed, leaving behind only the broader shape historians have since worked to recover. What we have spent tonight doing is filling that shape back in as carefully and as honestly as the evidence allows, aware the whole time that the true complete texture of any single evening belongs finally and only to the woman who actually lived it. There is something quietly grounding, too, in remembering that this same gap between lived experience and surviving record applies to every single person who has ever lived, queen or otherwise. Most human evenings across most of history left no trace at all, not because they mattered less, but simply because most people never had officers of the wardrobe logging their jewellery or ambassadors reporting on their appetite. Elizabeth's particular evenings survive, however partially, precisely because of the immense apparatus of record-keeping that surrounded her position, an apparatus most people of her era, and most people since, never had wrapped around their own private hours at all. Her evenings are visible to us largely by accident of rank, rather than by any special significance the evenings themselves actually held compared with anyone else's. And so what we are really doing tonight, carefully, gently, one detail at a time, is using the unusually thick record left behind by one particular life to stand in for something much larger, the ordinary, universal experience of an evening winding down, a body preparing for rest, whatever specific rituals happen to carry a person from the demands of the day into the stillness of the night. Elizabeth's version of that experience happened to be extraordinarily guarded, extraordinarily attended, extraordinarily documented in the ways that survive at all. Yours tonight is, in all likelihood, none of those things, and there is real comfort available in that difference, a simplicity her own evenings never had room for. There is no officer of the wardrobe waiting at your own door tonight, logging what you set aside before sleep, no guard posted in your hallway, no household of trained attendants required simply to help you rest. Whatever small rituals carry you toward sleep tonight belong entirely to you, unwatched, unrecorded, and needing no one's careful accounting at all. Let that thought settle now, gently, alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. Rest, in the end, does not require an audience, however grand or however carefully arranged. It only requires enough safety, enough warmth, enough quiet to finally let go. Whatever combination of people, habits, and familiar walls provides that particular gift in your own life, know it is enough, exactly as it is, tonight. Now at last, the room we have built together tonight can hold its final quiet a little longer. The fire has gone to soft grey ash now, still faintly warm beneath its surface, the way embers stay warm long after their light has finally faded. The candle, if it has not already guttered out on its own, flickers once, twice, and then settles into darkness, the room's last small point of light finally surrendering to the deeper, more complete darkness that always waits patiently beneath it. Somewhere beyond the heavy curtains, the guards continue their slow, familiar rounds, their footsteps by now so worn into routine that they barely disturb the stillness at all, simply another quiet layer within a night that has, by this hour, settled entirely into itself. Elizabeth sleeps now, or rests as close to sleep as any particular night ever actually allowed her, carrying within her, as she carried every single night across 45 long years, both the ordinary tiredness of a working woman at the close of a demanding day, and the vast, unbroken continuity of a crown that history would remember long after every single candle in this room had burned down to nothing, long after every guard and every attendant and every careful officer of the wardrobe had themselves passed quietly out of living memory. The palace holds its long, patient watch around her, the way it always did, the way palaces built for exactly this purpose always do, walls and guards and trusted women forming, together, the particular architecture that allowed one tired, extraordinary woman to occasionally, imperfectly, gratefully rest. And now gently let us leave her there, in that warm curtained darkness, attended and safe, and finally, for these last few hours before another demanding day inevitably arrives, simply allowed to be a woman asleep rather than a queen required to be endlessly, exhaustingly present for everyone around her. Wherever you are resting tonight, whatever quiet room actually holds you as you listen to these final words, I hope some small measure of that same hard-won stillness has settled over you too by now, the particular calm that comes not from perfect solitude, which so few of us truly have on any given night, but from the simpler, older comfort of being safe, being warm, being cared for in whatever form that care happens to take in your own particular life. Let your own breathing slow now, the way Elizabeth's own breathing surely slowed, eventually, on this particular imagined night, and on so many thousands of real ones across her extraordinary life. Let whatever weight you carried into this evening set itself down for a while, the way her crown, however briefly, however incompletely, always managed to set itself down too, somewhere in these quiet hours between one demanding day and the next. The guards remain posted, faithful and constant, whether we are imagining Elizabeth's world or simply your own. The fire settles further into its own gentle stillness, and sleep, patient and unhurried, finally arrives, the way it always eventually does, for a queen 4 centuries gone, and for you, right here, right now, drifting gently toward your own well-earned rest. There is no guard required at your own door for this same quiet feeling to be genuine tonight. There is no elaborate ceremony needed to earn it, no crown to set aside, no mask to remove before the real, tired, entirely human version of you is finally allowed to simply rest. Only the ordinary willingness to let the day end fully now, and to trust, for these last few minutes, that whatever tomorrow eventually asks of you can wait quietly, patiently, until morning actually comes. The palace fades now, gently, the way any well-told story eventually fades, its guards and candles and careful attendants settling back into the quiet distance of history where they belong, leaving behind only the particular warmth of the picture we built together tonight, warmth enough, I hope, to carry you the rest of the way toward your own genuine rest. 4 centuries separate her particular night from your own, and yet for this one quiet stretch of time together, that distance has felt, I hope, considerably smaller than it truly is, close enough that her old, patient stillness might settle over you too, just a little, just enough to help carry you the rest of the way towards sleep. Rest now, fully, gently, completely, for as long as you genuinely need to tonight, without anyone at all standing watch over how you do it. Whatever tomorrow eventually asks of you, it can wait quietly, patiently, until morning actually comes. Good night, friend. Sleep well, truly, completely, fully, for as long as this particular quiet night allows you to. I will be here again next time, whenever you need somewhere quiet to rest your thoughts for a while.